whatever today is. Wednesday, October 25th. Erica, do we have any general public comment for the opening? Not yet.
You might just do a call for it. And we
And
have a couple of announcements.
so just a reminder, if you want to do public comment, we have a open public comment right now, and then a brief one just before the FIP Capacity Building Awards, which should start shortly, and then one later in this afternoon at the end of the Oregon Agricultural Heritage Program presentation. And so if you've got a comment you want to make, please fill out one of the yellow slips and hand it to Derica at the end of the table on my left. Bruce Taylor with a late arrival.
Good morning, this is Randy Labby.
I want to make sure, is it general? Okay.
Before we get started, we're going to go to item J, and Courtney is going to lead us in that. I just want to take a moment to thank Maida and Derica and the rest of the staff for orchestrating such a memorable evening last night. For me, the highlight was the response of Carl, John, and Dan to our send-off. They had really eloquent and poignant remarks about their experience on OWEB. And for me, another highlight was Anne coming forward and requesting help in finding a new job for Carl. and our waitress, who felt compelled to speak up in defense of Carl. Anyway, it was a really memorable event, and thanks to all of you who made it such. Courtney?
And before Courtney comes up, just a quick logistic item for board members. So our planned adjournment had been 12:45 today. Given all of your good behavior yesterday and getting through 4 agenda items, we expect to be done before noon. There will be lunch available for board members and staff. It's a deli, build your own, so you can grab it to go. And Eric has been working with the those of you who are coming on the optional tour this afternoon, hosted by Greenbelt Land Trust. They're going to move that. How much sooner, Eric? Or basically, we can grab. When we're done, we'll eat lunch, and they'll be ready to take us out on the tour after that. So everything's moved up, hopefully by about an hour today, and we'll see if Courtney is able to keep us on that schedule this morning.
Thank you, Maida, for the challenge. Courtney Schaff, Capacity Programs Coordinator, and good morning, everybody. So this is agenda item J, the Focused Investment Partnership Capacity Building Grants. There are 3 action items we're going to ask the board to do as part of this agenda item. The first is to award the capacity building grants. The second is to delegate some funds for financial plans, and I'll talk about that when I get to that point in the agenda. And the third item is to ask the board to do a second capacity building FIP grant cycle this biennium. So I'll touch on all of those things as we get through the agenda item. I am going to do an introduction, and then we'll pause and have public comment related to the capacity building FIP applications, and I know we have several people here today providing public comment. Then I'll come back up and we'll discuss and take action on those 3 things I just listed. So are there any questions? Great. So just a quick reminder on the purpose for the capacity building FIP applications. They are to elevate partnerships, their current level of performance, but to elevate existing partnerships, produce a strategic action plan. They can enhance an existing action plan and address community engagement and outreach activities for the partnership's capacity building efforts. So in 1517, items, all 4 of these items, as part of the program in 1517 were all optional. Folks could do any combination of items 1 through 4. For 17-19, based on some lessons learned, both through the current capacity building FIPS as well as through the Partnership Learning Project, we allowed groups to create options. They can apply for options 1, 2, and 3. Number 4, addressing the community engagement within each community, was a required element of each application for this biennium, based on some really important lessons learned that outreach is really critical when you are creating a strategic action plan to be engaging that community that you're working within. Quick overview of the process. We announced the offering in January of 2017. We did hold consultations with all potential applicants, which was new this biennium. We held 16 consultations. Myself, as well as one of the Focused Investment Partnership staff, participated in all those consultations. So that was either Eric Williams, Eric Hartstein, or Andrew Dutter sat in with me in all those consultations. We received 7 applications by the deadline. We were a little surprised we didn't get more. We did some outreach to some folks after the deadline to find out why they didn't apply. In general, folks either decided that they weren't ready, or that it just wasn't quite the exact match of what they wanted to do, and they didn't want to go through the application process if they didn't feel like it was a good match for the goals of their partnership. OWEB staff reviewed the applications. The regional program reps provided excellent comments, spent some time reviewing the applications, as well as the FIP staff. And then we pulled together an expert team, which was great. We had a couple repeat reviewers from 15-17. And our team included Water Resources Department, Oregon Department of Ag, National Forest Foundation, OSU Extension, Bonneville Environmental Foundation, and the Farm Bureau. So we met for a day and discussed the applications. And in the spirit of Liz, I stole the concept from Liz and adapted this a little bit for our capacity building evaluation. So it was really important to me to help the capacity building reviewers kind of understand the target that we're reaching for when we're looking for these applications. So we're really looking for applications that have a likelihood of accomplishing their proposed deliverables, completing a new strategic action plan or updating their current one, developing their partnership, taking it to the next level, and engaging that community. So we based these evaluation criteria, again, based on the lessons learned from 15-17 and the great feedback we got through the Partnership Learning Project, which we shared with the board in July. So we were looking at the readiness of the partnership. Are they ready to go from where they are now to really a higher level of collaboration and performance around a strategic action plan? Do they have history working together? They're not just coming together because there's a grant offering with funding available. And how that partnership is structured and who's working together. They don't have to have all the ins and outs dialed out at a capacity building application, but do they have history of working together and they know how they want to work together? Do they have the capacity to do the project, for governance, to engage their community, to partner together? Do they have the ability to take the time to work hard? We've learned through the current grantees that it's a lot of work to have a partnership and write a collaborative strategic action plan. And do they have that capacity to coordinate the project? Is there leadership? Again, it's super important to have a clear leader within a partnership if you're trying to work together, pull groups together, and write a strategic action plan. And is there clarity within the application of the timeline, roles and responsibilities, and budget, and what they want to achieve? Are there any questions there? It's a quick map, and this is also attachment A in your staff report of the capacity building applications that we received for this cycle and staff's recommendation for those for funding and those for do not fund. This is attachment B in the staff report, and I'm going to take a few minutes here to talk a little bit about the staff recommendation. First off, I want to recognize that we realize that with this staff recommendation, we are leaving significant funds on the table, almost $580,000, which is why later today I will ask you to offer a second capacity building FIP cycle this biennium. But I also feel that this is the really appropriate funding recommendation to make at this time, and I'll touch on that why. So first, the bar is higher for our focused investment partnership programs than it is in our other grant programs. Staff and reviewers are looking for applications and partnerships that are really ready to launch to the next level. This program is not for everyone, and the board has articulated that through the development of this program. OWEB has a variety of grant programs we offer now, really quite an extraordinary portfolio for a state agency. And this program is different, and the bar is higher. There's also several elements of the capacity building FIP program that are critical to be included in an application to demonstrate a high likelihood of success. One of those is community engagement during the strategic action plan development process. During the 15-17 biennium, stakeholder engagement was optional. Lessons learned from this biennium, as well as through the Partnership Learning Project, caused us to make this change to make it a required component. The other part that's really critical is readiness to move from one level of coordination to the next. To launch partners from coordinating on projects, which many do well, to really a coordinated partnership working in collaboration to achieve a common mission, articulated through the Strategic Action Plan. The 3 applications that staff are not recommending for funding are missing one or both of these critical elements, which is why we're not recommending them for funding. This doesn't mean that they're not worthy projects or excellent partnerships adding value to their communities. It just means that those applications, the way they were described at this time, are really not ready for the FIP capacity building program. So I've had the opportunity to reach out to all 3 of these groups and had conversations with 2 of them to talk about staff's recommendation, how I'm willing to work with them to submit future applications and also to go down and meet with their partnerships if they would like me to. So I'm going to pause here, see if you have any questions about what I presented so far, and then we will have the public comment period, and then I'll come back up and we can discuss the applications in more detail.
Alan?
Courtney, you had mentioned that in the 15-17 cycle that the public outreach component was not really emphasized that strongly, but we've learned from that, and that was a component that really we wanted to add. Mm-hmm. And you also said that you interviewed over 17 prospective applicants?
Yes, 16. Mm-hmm.
16. And was that a key point that was brought up during that conversation, that you really have to do the outreach component of this?
We did talk about that change in the application, and that it went from an optional to a required component during that consultation process, yes.
Okay, thanks.
Rosemary?
Rosemary Furphy. Thank you, Courtney, for the introduction. Can you please remind me, do we have a current capacity building FIP on the Oregon coast?
So I, later today, I was going to show you later, but this is a map, and this map does include the ones recommended for staff funding right now. So we have the Central Coast Estuary Collaborative, which is a current capacity building FIP, okay. The Sayusla-Coho Partnership, and Wild Rivers Coast Estuary.
Okay, so we do.
Yes.
We don't in this recommended cycle, but we do have some.
That is correct.
If I may also, it isn't included on this map, but we also have 5 Coast Coho business plans along the coast as well. 3 current and I think 2 in the works. So we have, in addition, and those are developed in the exact same manner as this. It was just a program that started 2 years earlier that was kind of the pilot for this.
Questions? Okay.
We'll go to the comments. We'll commence the comment period for this and remind you that we'd like to have you not exceed 5 minutes at the table. When the lights blink red, bad things happen. Nell Scott first from Trout Unlimited, and Heather Hendrickson from the Nature Conservancy together.
Hi, everybody. Nell Scott with Trout Unlimited in Klamath Falls. We I talked yesterday as well, and then Heather Hendrickson with the Nature Conservancy in Klamath Falls. We're here as representatives of our entire partnership in the Klamath that applied for a FIP. So we were the ones who were able to come, but we have been meeting with our partnership quite a bit and talking about our actions forward. So I just wanted to come up and give a little chat about that. First of all, just wanted to thank the board for everything that you guys do. Thank the board and the staff for having these capacity FIP applications in this round, and then also for the really thoughtful and useful feedback that everyone has provided on our FIP capacity application. Though we weren't recommended for a FIP, we have gotten a lot of really useful feedback, and we're excited to take that and continue to move forward. It's also been great to be here in person and talk with people about sort of the process and the questions that people had about our application, and be able to really use that and produce a better application in the future. So based on the feedback that we've received, we have decided we're probably going to apply for a TA in the open solicitation round in the next week and a half. And so hopefully you'll be seeing something from our entire partnership in the next couple weeks with that round. And we really wanted to do that to keep our momentum going, keep the plan that we've already started going, while we also pursue other funding opportunities. We do have match funding from the Pacific Corps IM11 funding pot as well right now, so that'll really help us keep a lot of momentum going. And then also we will likely submit a portion of our application, of our reworked application, for the second round of the FIPS, if you guys do decide to consider that, the allocation of that leftover money. So we really encourage you to do that, because it'll definitely help a lot of the applicants who are interested in resubmitting with the feedback. And then finally, for my part, we have a really strong partnership in the Klamath. We're excited to continue working with that partnership and with all of our other partners in the basin. And you'll be hearing a lot more from us.
I'm Heather Hendrickson with the Nature Conservancy, also in Klamath Falls, and I just want to follow up with what Nell said and talk about a few of the other ongoing efforts and bigger things going on in the Klamath, just so you guys are kind of all aware. And some of these will definitely dovetail with the work that we're doing. So the first is Pacific Corps Interim Measure 11, and that's funding for water quality improvement projects. And right now, Pacific Corps has $5.4 million that they want to allocate to water quality projects in the Upper Klamath Basin. They're looking at 4 priority project types: diffuse source treatment wetlands, natural wetland restoration, piping and irrigation efficiency projects, and then riparian restoration projects. So these are all Upper Basin projects, and that team is going to be guided by a steering committee, and they'd like to use our action plan that we developed to guide where they're going to put the projects, some of the funding decisions, and things like that. So we're hoping to work a lot more closely with them here in the immediate future. Another effort is funded by the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service through the Pacific States Marine Fisheries Commission, and they are developing an integrated fisheries restoration and monitoring plan, and that is for the entire Klamath River Basin. They want to use adaptive management approaches to come up with prioritized projects and monitoring for the whole basin. They've already completed a synthesis report where they've put together all of the efforts ongoing in the Klamath. It's available on the IFRMP website. It's, like 600 pages or 300 pages. So, and they are funded for phase 2, which is going to start soon, where they will go into the subbasins of the Klamath and come up with more detailed plans for restoration and monitoring. And so our group is hoping to be the representative group for the Upper Klamath Basin in those efforts. The Klamath Basin Monitoring Program is another group that we collaborate with. They are a group of many stakeholders in the Klamath who look at water quality monitoring up and down the river, and also fisheries type monitoring as well. And they're having their meeting November 14th and 15th in Klamath Falls, and Nell will be giving a talk on one of her restoration projects in the Upper Klamath Basin, the Sun Creek project. But we also collaborate with them and work with them to disseminate information and get the word out on what we're doing. And then lastly, I just want to mention that the Deputy Commissioner for the Bureau of Reclamation, Mickelson, is really interested in working towards some sort of settlement in the Klamath with water users and the tribes. And so I think in the next couple of years, he's going to be really looking for some solutions. And we're not sure how we would ever interact with that effort, but we just want to keep doing the right things for the Klamath Basin. Thank you.
Thank you. Are there questions from the board for either Heather or Nell? Thanks to both of you. Oh, I'm sorry.
I just want to,
Carl.
already ignoring me, I can't believe it. We're very fortunate to have people the quality of Heather and Nell working in the Klamath Basin. And there's some really exciting partnerships going on, and OWEB, of course, is going to play a huge role in the future. I won't be here to remind you about the Klamath Basin, so don't forget about it.
Thank you.
Next, I would like to welcome Brooke Stanley from North Coast, representing North Coast Watershed Association and Lower Columbia Chum Recovery Partnership.
Hello, thank you. Brooke Stanley, North Coast Watershed Association. I traveled here from Astoria last night so I could be here this morning asking you to fund the Lower Columbia Chum Recovery Partnership Capacity Building FIP. This application was recommended for funding by the review team and was not recommended by staff. We applied last year and we were ranked 10 out of 23, and the first 9 were funded. So we felt we really had a good shot this year. We responded to all of the reviewers' comments from last year and put together a great application. We've been working on it since November. And we felt like it was a very strong application, so when we found out it was not funded, we were disappointed, and some of us a little upset even. The reasons that it was not funded that were given to us were that there was not enough outreach and not early enough. And one of the critiques from last year was that there was too much funding going to outreach, landowner outreach, and they didn't see how it fit into our strategic action plan. But we have seen from the beginning that we need landowner outreach for this project because this project is focused in the Youngs Bay and the Big Creek populations for chum, and those are largely private landowner areas. And so we need to get the landowners on board. And we've seen that last year, and we've seen that this year. We were criticized for not bringing, or critiqued, sorry, for not bringing the landowners in soon enough, but we have them in the 3 to 11 month part of our 24-month process. So we're bringing them in right around 3 months after we've solidified the MOU and hired our contractor. And the reason we're bringing them in a little bit later is just because we need to prioritize which stream reaches we want to work in before we go outreach to landowners. So there's a lot of landowners in these basins, and we want to figure out which areas we're working in before we reach out to those landowners. We're bringing on landowners before the development of the strategic action plan and including them in that, but we know that landowners don't really want to hear from us until we have our ducks in a row. We know what we want from them or what we want to work on with them, and if we're working in their area. The other main critique of our application was that we weren't, they kind of got hung up on this one line where we said in 3 to 5 years we would be meeting annually and communicating via email. And this was something we knew we could commit to. So for the next 2 years, we would be meeting monthly or bi-monthly, and then after that, we could go to annual meetings where we look at how we're going to implement this strategically. And I'm working with a vast partnership. We've got people with from different agencies, but we all work in different parts of the watershed. And so I saw these annual meetings as a way that we could strategically see where in the watershed we could be working on these projects, and then working in smaller groups throughout the year to implement those projects. For instance, we work with LSEP and CREST on our partnership, and they both have BPA funding to work in the estuary but not beyond the tidal reach. And so if we're working beyond the tidal reach, we're likely to be working with partners who have funding to work in those areas, while they're focusing on the lower reaches. And that was why we saw annual meetings as sufficient after the 2-year process here. And we did go on to say in the next line that if we went after the next level of FIP funding, we would be meeting more often than that. So this was just if we did not go after implementation FIP funding. And I also want to point out that in the description, and Courtney highlighted this as well, there are different things you can apply for the FIP for, and one of them is taking your partnership to a higher performing level, and the next one is to create a strategic action plan. And we're really going after that strategic action plan. We are improving our partnership and taking our partnership to the next level, but really with the goal of creating this strategic action plan for chum in the Youngs Bay and Big Creek populations and implementing that action plan. And we're not looking at partnership for the sake of partnership. That is our focus, is creating this strategic action plan. And from there and through this process, we will figure out the best way to implement that. I want to just let you know that this chum strategic action plan is very crucial to recovering chum on the Lower Columbia. These two populations have great recovery potential. We have 2 chum biologists on our team. We have Chris Hummel from ODFW, we have Curtis Rugner from NOAA, and both of them have identified these regions as being of great importance. There's a lot of potential here to make improvements through restoration, but first we need a strategic action plan. We have the team together that is ready to create this strategic action plan. We've been working on it for 2 years as a partnership to get this. And so I really encourage you today to fund the Lower Columbia Chum Recovery Partnership. And if you have any questions, I'm so happy to answer them. I could talk for a long time about this, but I know I'm not supposed to. So please ask me questions. And also, if you have major concerns, please consider funding this conditionally. We are willing to meet conditions. We had our application done early. We would have been able to address these earlier if we had had the opportunity. And we just really want to make this happen, and we're ready to make it happen. So I think I'll leave you with that.
Thank you. Questions from the board?
Ron Alvarado. Good morning.
Good morning.
You said that you still needed to prioritize the reaches. What time frame would that be?
That's going to happen in the first probably 3 to 4 months. We have the data, and so that's one of the jobs of our contractor. So in the first 2 months, we're hiring a contractor. And then the first thing we do with that contractor after developing our MOUs is to look at all that data and find create metrics to prioritize those stream reaches. So it's coming as early in the process as it can. We know that sometimes we created that second section of our timeline for 3 to 11 months just because we know things happen simultaneously and stretch out a little bit, but it's first on our list.
Well, thank you very much.
Randy, just a quick.
Oh, I'm sorry. John?
If this project is delayed or not funded at this point, what effect does that have? Is that going to totally inhibit your ability to come back at a later time next year or whenever and reapply?
I think, and I can't speak for certain, there's a chance we would go for this funding again. But we really feel like we're aiming at a moving target. And so I think most likely we would go for technical assistance funding in a local level because some of our members have a sense that maybe chum just isn't a priority for this region. And when I talk to Courtney, it's really more the capacity building questions that came up with the application. But I would guess that we would probably take another route, even though maybe this would be a good option for us. I'm not sure. But we are going to see this project through. And we have the partnership here now. And just honestly, it takes 2 months to get everyone's signatures from all these different agencies. So that's why I decided to take 2 days out of my work week, or really 3 days, to be here.
Dan?
Yeah, it's Dan Thorndike. I guess I'm trying to get the feel for again, sort of the developing the functioning partnership angle versus developing the strategic action plan. Because, well, FIPS in general and specifically the capacity building ones really, I mean, obviously it's a fairly new process for us. I mean, that's been based on other efforts we've done in other years. But clearly, as we've gone forward, the focus is very, very much on these kind of funding opportunities really being based on very highly effective, functioning partnerships. And that there just seems to be such a sort of energy that comes from, from that, which is not to say that you couldn't have, a single, highly functioning watershed council come up with a great strategic action plan to get stuff done. So, I mean, the getting stuff done part can be done, I think, in different ways, may or may not end up being an implemented FIP. But obviously the focus of this is how do you really leverage and get these other partners in. I just get from some of your comments, it seems like, again, that focus is still very much on just getting this plan going and then sort of having, it's not totally clear to me where that real partnership focus comes.
Yeah, so the partnership building is something that we're asking our contractor to help lead us through as far as developing the MOUs. We have an existing partnership, and we're interested in expanding that partnership, approaching the tribes, finding how to outreach to the fisheries community, and how to, we have existing partnerships with NRCS and SWCDs, which are going to be easy to pull in, but trying to figure out how to really get support for chum on the North Coast. So chum is considered the dogfish where I'm from in Astoria. I grew up there. People don't really care about chum, but this is something that those of us, I mean, obviously salmon people care about it, but not even a lot of fishermen. So it's a larger project than that. It's we're looking to create this partnership around, everyone on our team right now has a lot of expertise and is working in restoration, but we want to pull in more of the community and more of the landowners. And that's kind of where I come in. I work with the watershed councils, and I'm from there, and so it's easy for me to make those community connections, and same with Crest and the National Park Service who are working there in the community. But we really are trying through this FIP, we see this as an opportunity to make a big push for chum on the North Coast or on the Lower Columbia. And we'd like to see that be what it is. We don't want it to just be a strategic action plan, but if this funding category isn't working for us, that's, we'll take the route we need, but this could be so much more if we have the FIP capacity funding.
Okay, Alan. Jeez.
How many members are in your partnership?
I need to count. I think it's 7. Sorry about that. It's a lot.
Roughly
so
how many?
We've got ODFW, National Park Service, Crest, LSEP, Columbia SWCD, and then the Lower Columbia River Watershed Council.
And so the sequencing is that the partnership would form an MOU that would establish this core group, and the core group would use the capacity money to do a strategic action plan. And then after that's developed, you would do the outreach component?
No, actually, it's built in a lot sooner than that. So in the first 2 months when we're creating that MOU, we're also going to be working with our other partners. So we already have community partners, like I mentioned, the Clatsop SWCD and NRCS and some of the other community partners we already have, the Clatsop County. I can't think of a bunch off the top of my head, but we're going to be accessing our partners right early in the process to create different ways that partners can buy in. So either they can join the core group and be part of this really concerted effort to bring back chum, or they could join as like a, yes, we'll participate where advantageous. And then the landowner outreach portion comes in just after that, after we do the prioritized stream reaches. We're outreaching to landowners from the beginning before the strategic action plan is developed and bringing them into that process. And actually our strategic action plan, the final portion of it is going to incorporate where the willing landowners are, because that is such an important part of this project, is not only where are the best places that restoration might happen ideally, but where can it happen? And that's what we're trying to identify, is where are there landowners who actually are willing to make it happen and they live in a prioritized stream reach. And that's part of this whole process.
Right. Well, it sounds like a comprehensive approach. One of the things that caught my eye, though, was about your annual meetings.
Mm-hmm.
Do you think that's adequate enough to hold the team together?
I think it is, just from what I've seen from this team, as far as how ready everyone was to rally the troops this November when I found out there was going to be a capacity, another round of capacity building. Everyone joined in right away. People were driving from Clackamas to Astoria. That's a whole day's work just for a meeting. I see the partnership as being really strong, and people are already collaborating in other ways, and I don't see us only seeing each other or being in contact that one time. And I'm also willing to meet more often. If this is the hang-up, we can make quarterly meetings, we can make bi-monthly meetings, but I just don't want to commit to anything, more than 2 years out in the future without a real process around it. But I do see it as adequate just because we're in contact so much already. Working on these projects. So once we have a plan for the year, everyone plans out their actions ahead of time. And so when we have those actions planned, it's going to be pretty easy. If I'm working on a project with Crest and National Park Service, I'm going to be talking to them every week about it for the whole year. But if LSEP's not involved, they might not be part of that. So almost like a subcommittee sort of style.
Thank you.
Okay, well, thanks very much.
Thank you.
Finally, we have Bruce Taylor representing Pacific Birds. Welcome, Bruce.
Thank you very much. Good morning. I am Bruce Taylor, here to provide a little bit of context on a couple of the FIP applications. Some of you know me in connection with my work east of the Cascades with the Intermountain West Joint Venture and the Harney Basin Wetlands. FIP are already funding, but today I'm here for the other joint venture that operates in Oregon, Regional Bird Habitat Conservation Partnership, Pacific Birds. And just by way of background, like many conservation organizations, Pacific Birds suffers from a major disconnect between the size of its budget, which is very small, and the scope of its mission, which is bird habitat conservation from the north coast of California to Alaska, Hawaii, and the rest of the Pacific Islands. So we have been forced to focus, particularly in the last few years. And here in the Pacific Northwest, we have two priorities: oak and prairie habitats and coastal wetlands. And those were selected for many of the same reasons that those are priorities for OWEB's Focused Investment Partnerships program. And oak and prairie habitats have been a priority in the bird habitat and biodiversity conservation worlds for more than 20 years now. But the reality is a lot of good work has been done, but it's been fairly small projects, kind of fragmented, not much coordination, and not really any larger vision. So for Pacific Birds, we set out 2 years ago to try to help our partners get better organized and to think more strategically and to begin to frame oak and prairie habitat conservation as a larger regional priority. 2 years later, we now have a regional conservation business plan. I put business plan in quotes because it's not probably a business plan in the sense that a lot of business people would look at it, but it is a larger framework plan that quantifies the costs and the ambitions involved in oak and prairie habitat conservation on a regional scale. covers basically the range of Oregon white oak, which is Mendocino County in California, north to the southern end of Vancouver Island. That came out just a couple weeks ago, and I think that's really viewed by our partners as the overarching framework for oak and prairie habitat conservation in the Northwest. We also here in Oregon now have 4 local partnerships in various stages of development. 3 of them, the East Cascades Oak Partnership, the Willamette Valley Oak Prairie Cooperative, and the Klamath-Siskiyou Oak Network, have been recommended for funding for capacity building grants to help them develop strategic action plans to guide their work. And then there's a 4th group in the Portland metro area, the Intertwine Alliances Oak Prairie Working Group, that is just about finished with its strategic action planning process. So your support here today will jumpstart strategic action planning for oak and prairie conservation in the rest of the range of oak in Oregon, probably with a few small gaps out there. All 3 of the partnerships that have been recommended for funding here today have strong leadership, committed partners, and well thought out plans. We, Pacific Birds, are really excited about the opportunity to work with them, expecting to be really busy the next couple of years, and hope you'll join us in supporting this important planning effort. Thank you. I forgot to mention, I should, because I'm looking at Ron there. When I say that oak and prairie work has been happening in this kind of fragmented, non-programmatic kind of way, the exception has been the Natural Resource Conservation Service funding for some of this work, particularly in southern Oregon and parts of the Willamette Valley. But I think even the participants in those would say they have lacked the strategic focus that they're really looking for through this planning effort to get everybody on board on exactly where they want to work. Thanks.
Thank you. Any questions from the board? Okay, thank you.
All right, for the record, Courtney Schaff, Capacity Programs Coordinator, and now want to talk about and see if you guys have any questions about either the public comment or any of the other applications in front of you today.
Will.
Will Newhouser. In going through the applications, many of them, one of the criticisms was that the time frame seemed compressed. And I wonder if that's like 4 of the 7. I'm wondering if you have any comment about the consistency of people trying to compress their timelines or whatever.
So through the consultation process, I talked a little bit about how OWEB runs this program a little bit differently, and we want to enter into partnerships with those that we fund for the capacity building grantees, and do expect in general the work to take longer. So through the consultations, we did express that it is a 2-year grant, but we understand that the work could take longer, especially depending on the amount of outreach required and that they plan to do throughout the strategic action planning process. So we talked about that early, and also thought it was just really important through the evaluation process to let the partners know if we saw that as a concern when we were reviewing the application. So even those recommended for funding and those not, we wanted to make sure it was in the evaluation so folks kind of got that feedback early.
So since you addressed it in the consultations, but it still showed up in the finals, is there anything that you would, how would you approach the consultations next time to help?
I would, I guess maybe stress it even more. I think applicants come in, and even though you can verbally tell them, we know this is a 2-year program, we think it might take longer, it's okay that for your timeline to be longer, they're still going to try to meet that target. And so I think we could also think about in the language, if we offer another solicitation, saying it could be a 3-year program and giving folks a little bit more comfort level to extend their timelines.
Thank you.
Dan?
Yeah, Dan Thorndike. I realize it's sort of a separate question or task that we'll be doing in terms of authorizing an additional offering in 1719, but it's sort of relevant, I think, to how we look at some of the current applications and stuff. So maybe, what would the timing be for somebody who didn't get funded today,
Right.
to be able to reboot a little bit and come back into a cycle for the next opportunity?
Courtney Schaff,
Theoretically.
that's a great question. I can say we haven't settled on a timeline yet. I wanted the chance to have the conversation with the board today. Those of us working on the FIP program staff, Eric Williams, Andrew Dutter, and Eric Hartstein and I meet on a regular basis to talk about implementation aspects of the FIP programs, get their feedback, and also wanted to have the opportunity to have the follow-up conversations with those that are not funded. And so I don't have an answer for that. I want it to be an informed decision based on feedback from those not recommended for funding and other FIP staff and talking with MEDA. So would be open for thoughts from the board, and probably come back in January with more detailed timing. But I want to make sure we're getting feedback before we make that decision.
Rose?
Is there a range? I mean,
Well, so we have to, this is Courtney, we have to consider in-water work window and other application deadlines. So we have to consider either, in general, it would be something earlier in 2018 or in the fall of 2018, because it's not beneficial to our stakeholders if we put an application cycle and applications due right in the middle of the in-water work window.
Rosemary and then Alan.
A quick question. Rosemary Furphy. Courtney, what I don't see here are who are the partners, Pacific Northwest Conservation Blueprint? In the other applications, you state who applied and what the partnership is, and I don't see any organization listed for that.
So the applicant, this is Courtney Schaff, the applicant was EcoTrust. Okay. And I don't have the application in front of me. The partners included ODF&W, U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service. There were a lot of high-level agency partners, not any really local implementer partners.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Alan?
Dan had the same, I think we're thinking the same way in how we discuss the non-funded, the ones that weren't funded, and the testimony from folks who are here. If there was a sense that there was another opportunity coming up fairly shortly because we had that additional funding and because we learned from the first go-around, I think my arguments or my discussion or what I would offer to the board would be different than if, in fact, we weren't going to provide another opportunity. And I'm wondering if maybe what we should do is shift horses in the middle of the stream, so to speak, and speak to the issue of having an additional opportunity and then come back and talk more about these specific projects. Just kind of flip them.
Co-chairs are okay with
Okay, great. Well, I'm just going to throw this map up there as I start that conversation. This is with the context of those projects that staff have recommended for funding today. This is a map of the current capacity building and implementation FIPS to date and based on their priorities. So during this process, I've paused a little bit to think about, well, why didn't we get more applications? You know, we had 16 consultations. Why didn't we have more consultations? Why didn't we receive more applications? I've done a little bit of outreach to some groups in different parts of the state and heard in general that folks just weren't quite ready. As I said earlier, OWEB now has quite a large portfolio of different grant offerings. I do think at times some of our partners might get a little confused about which target goes where. So I think for the future FIP capacity building offerings, we can do a better job of outreaching the purpose of this grant offering and making sure we are getting our communication out broadly. If you think about the 15-17 biennium, when the board made the decision to move forward with the Focused Investment Partnership Program, there was a lot of outreach and communication about that program and a lot of energy around it. When we announced the grant offering for this biennium, we just put it out there like we would any other grant offering. And it's different, it's unique, it's a different program, and I think it probably needs a little bit more outreach for it, so that we're making sure we are targeting and hitting all the potential partners working in all the different geographies of the state. So before we do another grant offering, I think it's very important to do some outreach, do some phone calls, offer to meet with partners, and get some coordinated communication out there. I also think it's very important to continue to have the consultation process. I think it's beneficial for OWEB staff and the partners to understand each other prior to the application deadline. And so I do recommend that we move forward and offer another grant offering this biennium. I'm not comfortable today telling you when I think we should do that, because I do want to make sure we consider all those aspects that I think are important to have a successful grant offering before we settle on that date.
Rosemary?
Rosemary Furphy. So I guess Courtney, what I'm struggling with a little bit is that we may have some very strong applications that just need sort of a nuanced shift that might really bring it in line with what we're looking for and your objectives that you shared. And my sense, too, is the capacity program can evolve even while they're doing it. So it may not have, we don't think they've targeted as strong partnership meetings or number of things, but that's also part of what happens during the process. I mean, that's the whole, I think, purpose of strengthening that capacity. And I'm just wondering if there are ways if there are any of these that we feel are strong enough that with that recommended nuanced change could be funded this time. I don't know if that is too dramatic and I certainly respect the staff review. I just do see two of these that I think are very strong based on the organizations that are working together, the resources they're targeting. I'm also thinking of Deb Marriott, who came in with the Lower Columbia Estuary Partnership at our meeting in Boardman, and we talked about the value of the Columbia. So I'm showing my bias with regard to the Lower Columbia being an incredible resource, and all the species in the Columbia Basin that go through there. So I'm just wondering, is there any possibility, or is that too radical a thought that if any of those could be nuanced, changed? I'll just put that out there.
Courtney Schaff. So, of course, Rosemary, the board can decide to fund any of these applications today that staff don't recommend for funding. I do stand by the staff recommendation and the comments I made earlier that I do think these are high-quality partnerships, and I do think they're working well in their communities and addressing local concerns. I don't think either one right now is really poised for the capacity building FIP program and the purposes of that program, which the bar is higher. And yes, the partnerships evolve during their application process, but we really are looking, we did through the review process, and the reviewers did take a critical look to see if the partnerships really were ready to launch to that next level, from coordinating on individual projects to really a coordinated partnership looking at a long-term vision of implementing a strategic action plan collaboratively. And also whether they have a realization of how to do the outreach and when it needs to occur, and who needs to be engaged in that outreach process. Not all of them have the same concerns, but they all do have concerns that I think with some more time and effort, they can come with applications that are that meet the bar that we're looking for. But again, it's the board decision if they would like to fund any of them today.
Carl and then Debbie.
Specifically with the CHUM proposal, how much of, in your comment, you mentioned that it's a single species focus, and I couldn't tell if that was a criticism or just a statement of fact. And where is this?
It is not a criticism of the proposal.
Okay, because it says the proposed SAP has a very narrow single species focus, so that wasn't a factor in deciding against that. You said in the concluding analysis on that?
Oh, thank you. I was like, trying to find it.
Yeah, I couldn't tell if that.
It was not a criticism for not moving it forward. It was more kind of a realization, a calling it out of it. It is a very narrow focus, which is again a kind of a different approach, focused on one species. It's not precluding it or the reason it was not funded. Just kind of an acknowledgement of it. It's a very narrow focused proposal.
And given that and the diversity of these projects, and your statement earlier about there's different programs and different pots of money to get at different aspects. And so for either of these, it sounds like, at least with the Klamath, there's the opportunity for the technical assistance help there, that at least staff's conclusion is that's a better bridging approach for that particular one. And for the CHUM one, was I correct to hear that this is their second attempt at this?
That is correct. They were not recommended for funding last biennium either. So that is correct. And I do also believe, this is Courtney, that if, the purpose is to write a strategic action plan for CHUM and then implement it by individual groups throughout the basin and implement that strategic action plan individually on projects, then our open solicitation technical assistance planning grants is a good fit also for that partnership.
Okay. And I guess the corollary to that is you mentioned that there needs to be more outreach to explain to these groups what different programs we have available,
yeah,
so that there may be folks, because that's a lot of effort for the CHUM folks to have gone through the application process twice, when maybe there's a better place for them to be.
Yes, we definitely recognize that.
Debbie.
So, Debbie Holland, I just need to kind of check my understanding of the objectives and process around the capacity building for FIPS. And in my mind, when I think about this, we're looking and seeking groups that are ready to move from what I would call a transactional relationship as partners, right? So you can have different levels of partnership, and you can be transactional in your partnership. You come together, you do a one-off opportunity because there's a mutual objective. And we're looking for groups who are ready to move from that to what I would call a relationship-based partnership, who are ready to be in it for the long term, and maybe they don't quite know how to codify that desire or codify the terms of their relationship, but they're already ready to make that relationship commitment. And from that relationship commitment, you don't end up with individual one-off projects, you end up with this integrated approach. So is that an accurate assessment of what the purpose of the capacity building is, or have I taken it too far? So I'm trying to kind of check my own bar on what I think this project and process is about.
Courtney Schaff, very well articulated, Debbie, and that was definitely the conversation at the review team level, and also really part of the conversation and lessons learned shared through the Partnership Learning Project.
Dan.
Dan Thorndike. That's very much along the line I was going to say. I can even take it a little bit farther. And you have to excuse me too. I've been reading like astrophysics for lawyers and other dummies kind of stuff, so I'm kind of in this little astrophysical thing. But, and also from a perspective of the FIP subcommittee, so again, the FIP, and then there's the capacity building, and we've already sort of acknowledged that all capacity building FIPs don't necessarily result in something that's going to be an implemented FIP, but there's that value in it. But I think Debbie's comments really hook on that. So what we're looking at is trying to, there truly needs to be at least a strong potential for, I guess you'd say, an authentic functioning partnership is one of the key elements, regardless of what the desired ecological outcome is. And so getting back to the astrophysics thing is, it's like these gravitational forces need to align somewhere out there, and at this stage, before you get one of these capacity building grants, at least everything has to be aligned to some degree to where there's that potential for all these forces to go together and blow up, you know, and become a huge thing that they're now measuring with these weird little things all over the United States. But that's where I see, and I also, relative to that, I don't think there's harm in a little extra time for those groups to be working on aligning those stars before getting the operating capacity money. I mean, that's a positive. And you know, sometimes the stars align and sometimes they don't. It may be that one of the reasons it's difficult to get to that stage is there just really isn't that ability to end up with a really, as you said, a relational kind of one, as opposed to having a great partnership. You go do this and I'm doing that, that's a different thing. But I think with the FIP, we're trying to create these entities to where when you have an implementation FIP, yes, they are a lot of discrete partners, but on top of that, there's this kind of glowing entity that is the FIP itself. And you don't get there. I think that our history and our experience has been the ones that really work reach that point. The ones that don't reach that point get stuff done, but it's not that kind of value-added, you know, stuff that keeps it going on its own merits. So, you know, kind of rambling, but I think that's the tension kind of when we're going through these kind of applications, and some of it almost kind of has to be a gut feel, I think, to some degree. Is it at that point where if we sort of inoculate it with this little extra bit of money, is that going to, more likely than not, realizing we're not always going to hit it, but it's more likely not going to go lead to success. So with that, I'm kind of in favor of your recommendations.
Ron and then Alan, and then I'd like to ask the board their readiness to act, and Bob. Ron, Alan, and Bob.
I just, Ron Alvarado, regarding the Lower Columbia Chum proposal, the applicant stated they would consider conditional funding. The question is how they would prioritize that.
What would be the conditions?
Courtney Schaff, I'm not sure I understand your question. Are you,
so
how they would, if we put conditions on it, how they would prioritize that? We would work with any applicant that the board decides to fund with conditions to work out the details and the implementation around those conditions. That being said, I would say their current budget and plan are not planning for any conditions we might add to the grant.
Alan.
I was watching Dan again struggle with his words, trying to find out where to go, and it's very infrequent that he does that. But I think the reason that it is difficult on this particular issue is because we're trying to define what it really means to everybody. And it's a new program, and we're working our way into it as we go through this second cycle. And it really is hard to define what your partnership, what your relationship really is, and how strong it is, and what you need to do to make it better, and how we perceive it, and how we want to set a very strong bar for capacity grants, and how an organization may see it, and how they believe that they have a good relationship, but it's not there on paper, it's not coming through, or maybe it's just not there the way we want it to be. So it is a challenge for us to really look at this and say, in black and white terms, this is what we want. We're moving that way. We're better defining it, but for our applicants, it's a different story. And I know, Courtney, you interviewed them, and that's really helpful. And you've interviewed the ones that have been recommended for not funding, and that's been very helpful too. And I think all this process is better to define. It's good because it helps us better define what we're really looking for these grants. I suggest that if we follow through on the recommendations as staff has proposed, then we strongly look at, and I can't vote, otherwise I would, and I can't make a motion, otherwise I would, but we strongly look at funding this next cycle, and we do it in a fairly quick process, not wait till next fall. We've heard from two applicants who may not be funded. They've got some of the structure there. They've probably got a lot of the structure there to move forward, and timing might be important for them. And if we can do that, I would suggest that if we follow the staff's recommendations, we move forward with a fairly quick turnaround on another opportunity for capacity grants.
Thank you, Alan. Yeah, Bob?
Thank you, Bob Weber. When I looked at these applications, the Lower Columbia Chum Recovery Partnership was recommended by the review team for funding. And I assume it's staff that made the decision not to. And when I was reading the report, and it indicated in the analysis that it was a very narrow single species focus, I sort of took that as a negative. I mean, that was how I read that. And I was just wanting to be sure that people understand that chum in the lower river are listed, ESA listed. And when ODFW is trying to execute fisheries in the lower river, it's the lower river chum and the Snake River bee stocks that are constraining us, and that we don't have impacts to allow fishing. And so it may be single focus, but it's focused on a really important thing as far as Lower Columbia fisheries from at least my perspective. And I guess I have it's sort of, we got a lot of money here that we're taking off the table, and to fund the Lower Columbia, it seems like they're close, and we could still have an offering if we funded them and carried over to do it. So and my position will be to fund them, so, excuse me, that's just my personal thoughts.
Okay, thank you. Gary, go ahead. Then we need to really proceed.
Okay, I'll be quick. Gary Marshall. I think that, we want all these to succeed. And my thought is it's a little bit less about what we want. The question is, do they have the people, the partnerships, the individuals, the whole group in place to achieve what they want? And I think that's what Courtney is asking in a way, or that the staff is trying to dig out of these, is that are those partners there during the critical phases of this to get to the point where they're able to succeed at what their ultimate goal is? Or are they trying to put a goal out there and then trying to pull the people into it and get others to agree with what their goal is? So I think it's a matter of steps here that that the staff understands that has to be gone through before it really turns out to be a success.
I'll do.
Brandy, I have a question of procedure.
Go ahead.
When would be the appropriate time for an amendment after the motion is made?
Well, what I'd ask that we vote, we ask for resolutions on the proposals that are here, the resolutions that are here, and then be discussion and an opportunity for anybody to, and we'll offer, anybody can offer additional resolutions or modified resolutions. I really think this discussion has been worthwhile. I don't like to see us make new policy on the fly here. So I've asked for a resolution on this issue.
Will Newhouser, I move the board approve an additional capacity building FIP grant offering in 2018.
Is there a second?
Dan, second.
Is there any discussion? I asked for a vote on this resolution.
I would, just a question.
Yes, Bob.
We're basically voting for the four?
No, you're voting right now just on a second offering.
Okay, that's what.
Through the motions.
Will, Rosemary?
A second offering doesn't necessarily constrain what would be decided in the vote.
No.
So,
Nope.
okay, yeah, okay.
We have 8 eligible voters today, so we need 6 to pass this.
Yes, Laura is, had car trouble.
Yes. So, could, all in favor of the resolution, could you signify by raising your hand?
Of the second offering.
Of the second one?
Again, for clarification, that doesn't constrain.
No.
So-
That's 6, that's 8. 8.
Yeah, that passes. Okay, we'll go to the next one, Will.
I move the board approve, Will Newhouser, I move the board approve the staff funding recommendations as described in attachment B to the capacity building FIP grant awards staff report.
Is there a second?
Jason, my second.
Second by John. Are those in favor of this resolution, please raise your hand.
Or amend, you can either amend now, or you can do a new motion to add a new one. Either way.
Carl, I'm going to do another motion.
And I may do another one.
Okay.
Okay. Bob, you want to amend?
No, I would just,
Oh, okay.
I've done those
So-
after this.
Yeah.
we're talking about the first 4.
Just the ones recommended, yep.
Yeah.
Right.
Okay, so
This is Dan.
we'll vote on this one.
Yeah, we just voted.
And
Yep.
please raise your hand and if you support this one.
Unanimous?
Everybody?
Okay.
I have a motion to make, Randy.
All right, go ahead.
I move the board approve funding for project, and I hope this is right, 218-8300-15760 in attachment B of the capacity building FIP grant award staff report.
All right, any second? No second.
Yes, Carl
Oh,
seconded.
Carl second. Thank you.
Can I have an
Speak up,
amendment to that motion? Can I give an amendment to that?
You want to caucus with Bob and?
No.
Oh, yeah, we're close enough.
Okay, to preface this, I understand all the staff's position and moving forward, and the reason these were, the ones that were not recommended for funding were not recommended. But it's clear that ultimately the goal is that, and I'm presuming that's the same with the Chum one, but certainly with the Klamath. Yes, they're going to get there. They're going to be there. We're going to help them along. And the concept of conditions, we've used that before. We did that with capacity last year, and that seems to be working out. That a lot of this is timing this. We have a chunk of money, and it's sitting there. So, well, let's wait. We'll do it later. What I would propose, my amendment is that we also include the Upper Klamath Basin Watershed Action Plan team under the conditions that have already been expressed to me. As we know what we need. Those have to be met. Move ahead and fund this with the conditions that those things that have been identified get done, and the same with the Coho plan. So that's my amendment to Bob's motion.
Is to add the Klamath into that motion?
Add the Klamath to that.
With conditions as described in the...
That are well outlined in again, these reports on why things were and weren't funded have been very useful and clear, and those would be the conditions that would be required to be met to continue with the funding.
I don't know that I would agree to that amendment, because I want to do them individually if we're going to be looking at them.
Okay, we'll
I'm fine, one at a time.
One at a time.
We'll vote for one at a time on those. So, all in favor of the motion that Bob has set forth? Wait a second. We have a second. We have a second.
I second. Yeah. And I'll withdraw my amendment.
Okay. Will those, any other discussion from voting or non-voting members? Yes.
Jason Robinson. So the struggle I have with this one is that the proponents have brought this forth twice, and it's been not recommended for funding. And so, Courtney, my question to you is, as we look at this and really make a hard look at this decision, we talked yesterday about thinking about the future projects and where those are going, and we have to make the hard decisions early on so that we don't pay in the future. And so when I look at this as 2 times coming back, not being funded, it raises some questions to me in terms of the readiness. And if we vote for this now and we move it forward, even with contingencies, are we ripe to have this be a success? Or are we putting this money out there, and are we going to be reapproaching this in a few years saying, what happened with that partnership? And so I wanted to get a little bit more feedback from you in terms of what that looks like.
For the record, Courtney Schaff, I think Debbie articulated it really well earlier. I do believe if you decide to fund this application, you will get a strategic action plan. Myself and the review team does have concerns whether you're going to have a transactional partnership doing individual projects or a collaborative relationship partnership that's going to move forward and collectively implement a strategic action plan. I can't answer that for you. That's a risk you take with all the capacity building FIPs, but that was the concern raised during both of the review processes.
Debbie.
So the conditions are not clear to me. So if somebody could articulate what you think the conditions that we would put on that would be helpful to me.
I think this, Bob Weber, in my motion, I didn't put any conditions. I simply said that we would approve the Lower Columbia Chum Recovery Partnership.
You're right, and then it was Carl that amended with conditions, and then we withdrew. Sorry. trying to keep up here.
Okay. So, any further discussion? Alan?
To add to Jason's question, Courtney's response to that, I think Debbie did address that question. The question that I had too about how that partnership would work together in the long run relative to a suggestion in their proposal that they'd meet annually doesn't make sense. But I think that's something that could be addressed with what we've asked them to, with what we spoke about. And I think Debbie did talk about that and said, you know, if we needed to meet quarterly to make sure that we're together and better function as a unit, we can do that. As they proposed it, it doesn't make sense to meet annually, but if they're willing to make those shifts and they recognize that, I think that is a good thing.
Rosemary?
Thank you. Rosemary Furphy. I know I can't vote on this, but I do want to emphasize the partners in the Lower Columbia Chum Recovery Partnership are nationally recognized. They are the experts on this. There may be the nuance that they're not getting, which I think this capacity grant can help them develop, but I have the confidence in the organizations that are brought together, national leaders, and they're based locally. I have tremendous confidence that they can step forward and intellectually and technically understand what we're trying to achieve. So I do have high confidence there, and holding them accountable for what we're trying to, the goal of this program. Thank you.
Okay, we'll vote now on Bob's resolution. All those in favor, please signify by raising your hand. Okay, so that goes down. Are there any other resolutions? Okay, thank you very much.
Given that vote, I think not.
Thank you very much, and Courtney, thanks.
We have one, this is Courtney, one more quick order of business. We, at the July board meeting, when you approved the spending plan, you delegated to Maida some funds to develop financial plans with the current capacity building FIPS. We did not, at that time, develop into the current process, this financial plan process, to add additional funds. So I would ask again that the board delegate to Maida additional funds that we can work with these capacity building FIPS that you just awarded today to offer them funds to write and develop financial plans as part of their capacity building FIP process.
May I make a final motion?
Absolutely, Dan.
Okay. I move the board delegate to the executive director up to $60,000 to be allocated from the capacity building FIP spending plan item to be used for developing financial plans for the recommended applications described in attachment B.
Second by Gary. Any further discussion or ideas for new resolutions? Alan.
Question on that. This was a special amendment, a special motion. Are we going to, in the future, look at, okay, this will be added to and considered in, okay.
Yes, Courtney, the financial plan questions that I developed with the other FIP staff are going to be incorporated into any future grant offerings. Just with the timing of the lessons learned and making these decisions, it was not incorporated into the current grant offering.
Thank you very much.
Okay. All those in favor of this motion, proposal number 2, please signify by saying aye.
Aye.
Aye. Opposed? Thank you.
Thank you all very much.
Thank you.
Yeah. Okay, we're going to move along to item 11. Strategic implementation areas, coordinated stream sign management, and Maida, you're in charge.
For the record, Maida Lofsgarden, Executive Director. I am joined here by my twin in Pendleton clothing, Lisa Hansen, who is the Deputy Director for the Oregon Department of Agriculture.
I'm just going to add, it wasn't planned.
It works, though.
Yes. So we're here today to give a presentation to you on a similar line of a presentation that we gave to the Oregon Department of Agriculture back in late September down in Klamath Falls. And apologies, Laura Masterson was there for that conversation. She is having car trouble this morning trying to get her way back down here. She isn't probably going to be here until about 10:30. But she has a very strong
We could have sent
interest.
Joan out to go get her.
We should have sent Joan to go get her. So what we want to talk with you about this morning, at the July board meeting, you awarded $1 million for strategic implementation areas in a coordinated effort between the Oregon Department of Agriculture, Oregon Watershed Enhancement Board, as well as the Department of Fish and Wildlife and Department of Environmental Quality, with assumed investments as well from Natural Resources Conservation Service. What Lisa and I would like to do this morning is just spend a little bit of time with you talking about what that looks like in the new program and some of the things that we are thinking about. So we do not have a formal presentation. We've been talking about this quite a bit with a number of groups over the summer and fall. So you'll find in your board book under agenda item L, attachment A is the document that we're going to be walking through with you today. We're not going to walk through every single piece of it, but we want to talk about some of the key areas of this program in particular because there's interest from a lot of agencies in this work. We want to make sure you're up to speed. We will be coming back with updates in the future as well, but we just want to make sure that you're aware of the program. So I'm going to give just a big, broad overview. In the 15-17 biennium, you provided $1 million of funding for this same program to implement projects on the ground in areas that were identified as strategic priorities through a process with the Oregon Department of Agriculture. We invested those funds in projects on the ground, and we learned a lot through that process that we're really excited to incorporate into this, what we're calling kind of version 2.0, the lessons learned from the first biennium. And from a big perspective, a few of the lessons we learned were that we have an opportunity in these areas to put monitoring in place up front in this program, and that was not something that we did with the first set of strategic implementation areas. So this focuses on water quality in agriculturally influenced areas, and if we're going to be in there for a protracted amount of time working with our local partners on making improvements to water quality tied to agriculture, let's work with DEQ to put the data monitoring in place up front so that, as I've heard from Alan many times, we can track over time, is what we're doing going to make a difference on the ground? So that's one of the big shifts you'll see as we talk about this. The second is that we really need to lead and spend some more time working on the incentive-based conservation approaches, providing landowners the opportunity to really move us beyond compliance to meeting the goals of the local area plans. And we think we've got some opportunities to do that in a different way. And then with those who need some extra encouragement, we still have in the compliance with the state regulation that ODA provides. So that's just a big, broad picture that we're really trying to incorporate all of these three components together. And I'll turn it to you, Lisa, and then we'll walk through some specifics.
So I think I'm going to even take it maybe a level above the specifics that Maida talked about. For the record, Lisa Hansen, Deputy Director with the Department of Agriculture. Some of you may know or are familiar with our Ag Water Quality Program, and Oregon's Ag Water Quality Program is quite unique nationally. It's an outcomes-based program, which is very different than what you see in other states, which are Ag Practices Act. Our program really, at the foundation, is based on partnerships. And it has been from the initiation of it many, many years ago. We have a very, very broad and large responsibility with a big footprint in the state, but with a relatively small staff. And so ODAs, as I look at it, where we're at today, we really need to focus on compliance and moving people along into compliance with those local area rules. But to get the uplift that we need for water quality in the state to meet our goals, we have an incentive-based piece that needs a lot of focus as well. And that's really where we look to partners to help us, whether it be the soil and water conservation districts, whether it be the watershed councils. And you all at OWEB are one of our greatest partners because you have the ability to put money into places where it really matters and there's a public benefit to it. And so I'm excited about what she calls it 2.0, I call it tweaking, in terms of modifications to our strategic implementation areas and the program. What we have been noodling with lots of groups over the last probably 4 months-ish, really is adding a couple of components and changing the timelines a little bit. And as Maida said, probably the biggest addition and one of the most important to helping us in many places in terms of regulatory, with challenges with some of our programs meeting EPA requirements, with some of our challenges in terms of people who don't like the Oregon way, is being able to show that we're actually making a difference. And that requires monitoring. And we haven't had the funding to be able to do that in a very strategic and planned way to show the outcomes that we would like to. Where monitoring has been done and work has been done, I mean, Maida can speak to those, and you all probably know them better than I do, we do see positive impacts. And so that is probably the greatest change in this. And then as we talk about it in terms of tweaking of timelines, it really lengthens some of the timelines out. Now, some will say that's a bad thing because ag needs to do more and ag needs to do it faster. But what it allows us to do by readjusting timelines is to better align it with your programs, the grant programs, to better align it with work that NRCS is doing on a voluntary basis in strategic places so that we can really see some contiguous work that makes a difference. And then along with that, for ODA, it allows us to focus even more so on the compliance piece. And we've seen where we go in and have conversations about compliance, people move along. We have history where we have a strong regulatory backstop, and we've used that. But generally speaking, if you show people what they need to do, explain to them why they need to do it in our ag community, we can move them along relatively easily. It takes time and it takes resources. That is one of our biggest challenges. And so as we've worked on this, I think for ODA, the benefit is we really enhance our partnership with the boots on the ground and the funders. And then it allows us to focus more on that compliance piece and getting more done in more places. How's that?
So one of the reasons that we set up this board meeting in the way that we did with the tour that we had yesterday and then the presentation that we had this morning is I want you to actually get a picture in your mind of what we're talking about. So if you remember the before and after pictures yesterday when we were out on Hamilton Creek. Hamilton Creek, there were areas where farming was going right up to bank edge, right, in some of those before pictures. There were also areas where farming wasn't going right up to the bank edge, but it was blackberry or other non-native species, right? To move that landowner into compliance, they need to move back from the bank edge, right? That's the simple. You've got to get yourself off the edge of the bank. To get us to the point where we're meeting agriculture water quality goals in local areas, what we saw yesterday, the planting that had occurred since 2012, where we're looking at, in some areas 35 feet back, 40, 50 feet back, that's moving us beyond what the regulation base is and moving us to what we really need to do to achieve our agriculture water quality goals locally. And that's what this program is focused on. It's not focused on let's just move back from the bank. That's the compliance portion. It's focused on how do we actually get landowners to do what we saw Randy doing yesterday and really moving to a different place and using the CREP program or using EQIP if that was the program he was interested in, using our funds to really take himself to the next level. So with that picture in your head of what we saw yesterday, the way this process moves is ODA is going to select 6 areas a year. I also want you to think a little bit about the Focus Investment Partnership. We have selected priorities in the state that are habitat-based for FIP. We do not have a specific water quality FIP focus. We have a lot of habitat focus. In my mind, the strategic implementation areas is the equivalent of the FIP program on the water quality side. So working with ODA and local partners, we select 6 areas a year. much more finitely focused than you would think of in a FIP, but they are strategic areas where we are putting common resources into one place. In those 6 areas that are selected a year, we're going to go into a 4-year process. First thing is to get monitoring on the ground, and if you look on the back of the first page, there's a nice set of arrows. The first thing that we do is identify those areas, first in coordination with the state agencies, including ODF&W, so we do have a habitat component as well as DEQ. Select those areas in coordination with local partners, and immediately we will be putting monitoring stations in the ground so that we can do watershed scale monitoring in those areas. From the monitoring perspective, that actually will go out to year 10 and beyond if needed. So monitoring is going to continue with those stations in the ground. We're going to be training the districts and the councils, whoever's working in that area, to complete the monitoring. As Lisa said, there are some areas in the state, Whitechoose Creek, the Wilson over on the coast, where we are seeing improvements in places where monitoring was already in place. What we're doing here is proactively putting that monitoring in these new areas. From a voluntary perspective, the $1 million that you provided in July is actually going to go for technical assistance funding. What we learned in the first phase is if we provided the funding just for projects on the ground, we were probably missing the mark. You heard about how long it took to work with Randy yesterday, right? So when we were starting this program last biennium, what we were saying is pick an area, go work with landowners, and we've got money for you on the ground, all within like a year time frame. And it might take 2 or 3 years to get a landowner on board, particularly a landowner who is not now in compliance, who hasn't worked with Farm Bill or other programs before. So we were making an assumption that they could just do projects right away, when what they need is time to do landowner engagement, to develop these strategies, to figure out which landowners they need to work with and how, to go through the local work group process with NRCS. We weren't allowing time for any of that to develop. So in this area, those technical assistance grants really provide the districts and the councils the ability to do what we all expect in terms of a coordinated strategic approach, and to really get the funding lined out. We then have small grants. We have regular grants. NRCS has EQIP funding, Conservation Stewardship Program. We have the CREP program. We have the money in place to do the on-the-ground work. It's getting the landowners lined up. And in this area, what's different than FIP is these are areas where we have to address those landowner pieces in order to meet the agriculture water quality compliance and to meet the local area plans. So we've got to really ramp up the landowner outreach, because you got to hit that whole stream reach, right, in order to meet the goals that we have. So the voluntary implementation continues intensively years 0 through 4. On the back side of that, there's compliance and enforcement. That continues, that does not go away during this process. The key from the compliance perspective is we allow that voluntary piece to be able to work its way through before we come in with a strong compliance component.
So, and I've started to think about this rather than voluntary piece as incentive-based. How do you give people the incentives to do the extra bit that we need to get past just having them meet the rules? Because the stepping back part isn't so hard, right, to meet the rules. It's that investment piece and the additional work to manage that to create a good riparian structure. And so, again, I would go back to some of the things our program's been criticized for. It's a voluntary program. I've heard that for years. No, we have a regulatory program, and we have a strong regulatory backstop. But we rely on this as an incentive-based uplift to get us to the goals that we need in this state to meet all of our water quality responsibilities.
The other key component in this, and you'll see it under the voluntary piece, is what we've learned from our local partners is that they want to learn from their other local partners. And you saw that a little bit yesterday again with the planting, that the model watersheds have been learning from each other about how to do that incredible dense planting that works really well in the Willamette. They learned that from each other. And so the other component that we have incorporated intentionally into this is a training and peer-to-peer learning. So that's, we're adding a day to connect. It was mentioned yesterday, couldn't we just add the FIP piece to the end of Connect? We've already added a day to connect to talk about riparian specifically. We are adding cultural resources training. We are adding peer-to-peer training regionally across the state, so that we have built this to a level that across the state people understand how this program will work. The other thing that we're proposing, some of you remember a year or two ago, John Byers came and presented this kind of concept. And he said there are 2,500 watersheds in the state that are agriculturally influenced. And we are talking about doing 6 of them a year. And Alan is sitting over in the corner saying, I don't think 6 a year is really going to get you to the point, right, that you need to get to in agriculture water quality. What we're proposing now is that we spread those 6 across the state, and we use this as the model for how we will be doing agriculture water quality everywhere in the future. So over the course of the next 5 to 7 years, we will have one of these in every single district in the state as a training opportunity, so districts will be then continuing this on their own within their districts. It will, 10 years from now, this will be the way that they are doing business in all of their watersheds. So instead of us trying to hit 2,500, our districts and our councils are using this as the model for how they do work in their area.
And I would just add to that, we forget sometimes when we talk about the strategic implementation areas, yes, there are 6 a year initiated by the state. But as part of the ongoing funding to the soil and water conservation districts, each one of those districts is required to have a focus area, which is their own model of strategic work in a watershed, but not necessarily having us there with the compliance focus right at that time. That one, I think, if you want to talk about voluntary, that is more on a voluntary basis. But the districts are required in their statements of work to have these focus areas. And so what we can take from the models that we're putting in place and move into that allows us to have a much larger impact in terms of changes in the agricultural landscape.
So there's more information here. I just want to point you to the very end. So the following the arrow diagram, there's some details about each of those components that you can take a look at if you would like. At the end, there's an article that was just in the Capitol Press last month. So we just want to highlight that this conversation is going out fairly broadly. We've met with the Farm Bureau and the cattlemen. We're meeting with environmental groups at the end of the month and a larger group of agriculture folks after that. Really, this is something, as Lisa talks about, that we're noodling on, so changes are going to continue to occur. This is not something that we feel like right now is final, but we think it's at a stage that we wanted to make sure that you all knew what we were talking about and how that $1 million was going to be invested. So I think we'll stop now and see if there are any questions from the board.
Will Newhouser. So when you start a program, it always makes sense to have a pilot project, and you often look for the most willing, capable people to start that. So I'm a little more curious about after that, has gotten going. Talking about selecting the strategic implementation areas based on need, water quality, and habitat, et cetera. So how do you evaluate the need part, and given the limited funding that's going to be available for the foreseeable future? I'll get to that issue in a second. That is a second comment. How do you start making sure that we're hitting the ones that will make the biggest difference, as opposed to the ones that are just easiest to do after the initial, where you need the easy to do too, to be able to set examples for people?
So a couple pieces to that. In the initial ones, there were 2 pilots in the first biennium, and then there were 6 last time. So we have 8 right now, and you're right. I wouldn't say they were the easiest watersheds. One of them was Johnson Creek, which I think might be the most complex watershed in the state. But we did tend at the beginning to go with districts and councils that had higher capacity. Because we wanted to test this. We were brand new at it. We really wanted to test with some folks who could give us some solid feedback and had good capacity. What we heard from them, one was, give us technical assistance dollars, because it's an extra effort. It's different for us to be going where we're going, and so that's part of the change here. In terms of identifying the areas, we have a phenomenal team with folks from Department of Environmental Quality, our staff, ODA's staff, and Department of Fish and Wildlife. They are doing an excellent job of identifying the highest need. So we are looking right now at those areas where the highest water quality need overlaps with the highest fish need in the state. And so they are stepping away from who has the capacity and what's easiest and pointing us directly to those areas that actually are the highest need in the state already.
And I would just add to that, the staff have done an amazing job of actually creating a criteria, and if they were here, they would walk you through all the parts and pieces of it, but to try and funnel it, basically. To say, okay, here are areas we don't worry about because they're federal lands. Here are areas that we don't worry about because there's not a connection of ag and water, because it's the Ag Water Quality Program, but here are the areas. Then overlaying the next layer of, okay, what water quality data do we have? That would be the DEQ piece. What data do we have in terms of species issues? That's the ODF and WP, and bringing that together, and it comes up with basically a numeric number that begins to rank places. One of the challenges that we have is, in some cases, the highest numbers are in like one area. You could lean towards the coast, but we have a statewide program, and so we have to balance that out. And I think, again, when I think about the program and conversations over the last several years and where we get criticism, well, but you're not going to the places with the highest needs. We're getting to some of them, but we need to remember our program goes statewide. And so how, in terms of that, trying to be equitable, implementation and focus is an ongoing challenge, but I think in terms of criteria, the staff have done a really good job of collaboratively working together to put a process in place that helps them to funnel that down.
Ron and then John.
Ron Alvarado, good morning. I just want to speak to a few points that you folks made. We refer to the technical assistance, the boots on the ground, as planning first for NRCS, conservation planning. And I just want to emphasize the importance of that particular point in working with the farmers and ranchers to understand, one, what their objectives are, and how they can help address water quality. We can't always assume that farmers and ranchers are eager and waiting to jump into a program. A lot of times they haven't worked with federal or state agencies, so what the boots on the ground does, it allows us to build relationships, trust, right? And then once that's developed, then we can move them into a certain program, whether it's our program, OWEB, or another program. Will had a good question about where we work, and I have to agree that we have the information on where we need to work. We're involved in understanding where that is. It's helping NRCS focus our resources on where we need to start and prioritize. With all the resources we have here in Oregon, it's just not enough. We have to prioritize, and we have to start somewhere. And that the analysis that's being done for us is a good way of doing that. And I guess lastly I'll say regarding the focus areas that the SWCDs are required to address, in many cases we're alongside them, and we are in a lot of those areas with them. So today we are focusing in the same areas and working on some implementation. So I just want to emphasize those points and look forward to moving that along.
John and then Will.
Yeah, John Roberts. Hi, Lisa. It's good to see you again. But did Senate Bill 1010 impose a compliance deadline across the state, or is it open-ended? How is that working?
So Senate Bill 1010 allowed the agency, provided the authority, responsibility, to set up the area plans and rules. There is an expectation that farmers and ranchers comply with those rules. But it's an ongoing process. I think one of the challenges that we talk about a lot, and it's not very satisfying to some people, you can be in compliance today and have something go wrong on the farm because of the natural environment and be out of compliance tomorrow. And so it is an ongoing process, and changes of ownership in properties continue to provide challenges, because you can have, you know, Farmer X that knows what he should be doing, and Farmer Y takes over that operation and completely changes it, and then we're back out of compliance. The challenge is we don't have a good analysis or a good way to say, oh, here's the percentage in compliance in this state. What strategic implementation has allowed us to do, and I think begin to understand better by looking at these watersheds and doing the analysis, we're getting a better sense and an ability to talk about compliance. Again, I would say compliance in many cases is not terribly hard to get in compliance with the riparian rule. It's a step back and allowing vegetation to grow to provide the functions for water quality, stream bank stability, filtration, and shade, basically. It takes time for a couple of them, but not terribly hard. But that doesn't necessarily get the right species, plantings there without an active management. And so that active management piece is really where we need to put additional focus, again, on that incentive base. But it's ongoing.
Will.
I hesitate to say this. It's more of a comment, and it follows Ron's observation, and the one we all have, which is that the amount of money is not very big for the scale of the problem. I did a little back of the envelope at 2,500 watersheds and call it 10 to 100 miles each at $25,000 a mile. That's $600 million to $6 billion of work ahead, or 600 to 6,000 years at the current rate. And this program isn't designed to solve that whole problem, but just it's relevant to some of the other conversations we've had outside of the meeting about another example, like with tide gates and with piping projects and the ag water quality, independent of large wood emplacements and beaver dams and all kinds of other stuff for habitat and fish. That, you know, the scale of the problem, I think we need to not forget about, because while we're doing this, we also need to be thinking about how do we change the equation in this state so that we can start approaching the problem at the scale that they deserve.
We want to respond to your comment, even though it was a comment.
So one of the things I think that we have learned in working with our partners at ODF&W and DEQ, and for me specifically really working with DEQ, is there are places that really, really matter. And if we can find those places that really, really matter and focus the effort there, it's going to make a lot of difference versus, you know, there are places where we could do work where it's probably not going to make as much difference. And so that to me gives us a little more hope than the 100 years and billions of dollars. We also don't necessarily account for, as we talk about this, what farmers and ranchers are doing today on their own. And there are a lot of good things happening. Our process has begun to account for that as well. And so it cannot, I don't think there's an expectation by any of us that the funds at OWEB, the incentive-based funds, are going to fix everything in the state. I mean, there is a lot to do, and we need to consider the farmers and ranchers and what they're doing as part of that partnership, but also as we look to areas, we need to look to those areas where the work really, really matters.
Yeah, so that was obviously part of my first question about how you identify the most important priorities. With respect to the voluntary actions that are already happening, those are, of course, extremely valuable. They're also vastly inadequate, because otherwise we wouldn't be in this situation. But building on that, you know, that's part of why I'd like being involved with OWEB is I believe that the voluntary actions and the kinds of approach we take are extremely valuable. But the scope of the problem is still quite large. So, one of the things that I think is interesting sometimes is how the money is applied. I think occasionally one of the issues with voluntary stuff is that typically when it's grant-based like this sort of thing, there's a longer cycle involved. And sometimes that's just because of the nature of the people, but sometimes it's the difference in the way money is available changes the equation enormously. And I'm thinking of things like Tualatin River and work that the Freshwater Trust has been doing, where if you have a large pot of money that you can go apply now, as opposed to, hey, let's together go put together a grant proposal and so forth, that's a very different experience for the landowner, and therefore turns out you actually get a lot more people involved when you can do that kind of thing, even with the same dollars, if you will. But you have to have enough to apply in one place all at once that you can say, I can do a deal with you today, as opposed to let's go apply to OWEB and ODA in their grant application that will start in 6 months and end 6 months afterwards, and that sort of thing.
Absolutely.
So I love the program, and I'm glad to see the direction we're going, because part of that you have to get the people on the ground comfortable and ready for some of the bigger things. But I just don't want us to lose the fact that ultimately we're going to need a lot more money to apply to this and other programs in order to achieve the goals ultimately.
Alan, Dan, and then Randy.
Hi, Lisa. Thanks for coming to the board today. I like the EPA has been involved a bit in the SIP process and the SIA strategic implementation areas and the focused areas, and I really think that it's a very good initiative. It's really a neat process to see how that's being laid out. I think one of the key things, and we enjoy working with your people, Joe and Kevin, Fenn. They're excellent to work with, and so it's really fun to see that on the ground. I think Will spoke to scope, which has been one of my concerns, and it still is. And time solves that, but it is still an issue at the scope in which the SIAs are being implemented. But one of the concerns, and I'm not sure how to get at it, is that the ag water quality management plans are the foundation. They're the Bible for what gets implemented where. And they are supposed to define the barriers, the boundaries. And with those are their individual ag rules, as you very well know. Both often are very broad and not specific. And so you have one that directs you on how to implement and what to do, and the other one provides the boundaries for what you can do, whatever you're doing. How do you get to the point where you become more inclusive in, especially the ag water quality management plan? So you set milestones, you set priorities, you set goals that you have to have, and you track those goals over time. That is the operational document for ag groups, for areas where SIAs are being implemented, and bringing those up to date. I know some are. It's a slow process, and each ag area, they have their own personalities, so it's really kind of challenging to see it change automatically. But those are the functional tools for those ag areas. How do you move those forward?
Well, you did a very nice job describing our program, Alan. Thank you. You know it intimately. So as a reminder, those area plans and rules, you're right, they are the big book. We do biennial reviews of those. And basically what we've gone to as our responsibility has changed. The initial process when Senate Bill 1010 was passed really was much about implementation and getting those area plans and rules across the state. And it took a while, and it was complicated, and in many cases there was a lot of controversy, especially around the rules and the riparian rule. But the riparian rule is in place in every one of our plans, all the basins. That said, we look at those biennially, and on a fourth year, basically, there's a heavy review. We have been, as we've been going through and doing the heavy reviews, implementing into all of those plans timelines and milestones. And so it's an ongoing process of updating them as we go along, but we're getting closer to adding those in so that we can begin to have measurement. And that is a challenge for us, and we've talked about it a lot in our meetings, to give us measurement. One of the things that I am so passionate about when we talk about coordinated streamside management, the noodling, the tweaking of the initiative, is the monitoring piece, because that will help us as well. We can measure many of the landscape things that we do. We've talked about them with you previously in lots of meetings. We can count posts, we can count trees, but what is it doing? We want to see the in-stream response. This is the enhancement, to be able to see for all of that work what the in-stream response is, and where, if we're making any movement on the dial.
So I know we spoke to monitoring. What monitoring is being proposed? I mean, is it implementation monitoring, effectiveness monitoring, water quality monitoring, all of it, whatever the site provides? Or
For this proposal, both implementation and water quality monitoring. So water quality stations in stream, depending on whether it's nutrient, sediment, temperature, and then, so that's the in-stream water quality monitoring. Associated with that will be implementation monitoring. Did we plant what we planted, and how's it growing? Just like we saw with Randy's place. Are we doing the right site prep? Are we doing that kind of work? That is adaptive management for, are the plantings doing what they're supposed to? And then water quality is the other component. There are areas, and I think Renee will talk about this with the monitoring committee, where we may say, we want to do some effectiveness monitoring in this area. This is an interesting area, or it's a representative area. That's not specifically in this program, but I think some of those may pop out of this process.
one last thing, and I'll go on. The $1 million that OWEB's provided is for technical assistance. How do you see that being used? To write farm plans, or to address issues where you find that compliance is needed, or where you find that compliance may not be needed, but there's a better approach to do what's being done on the ground?
Yes.
All of them.
Stakeholder engagement, landowner outreach, just to get there in the first place. So it is, every one of those steps is what we found that the local organizations really needed to focus their efforts. So one area, it might just be farm plans. In another area, they've never talked to a group of Hispanic farmers who happen to be managing that. Oh, okay. So it might be developing Hispanic brochures. It is what is needed in the area to get to that point of actually being able to do the projects on the ground.
Okay, setting the stage.
Yep.
Thank you.
Dan.
Yeah, Dan Thorndike.
Then Randy.
I mean, getting to the micro level away from the macro, I mean, I really like this program. I just see huge value, and I think the tour yesterday highlighted a lot of that. I mean, I work with farmers. My wife's farmer. She works with farmers, and and the farmers I know want to do what's right. But they don't have time. I mean, they're farming 26 hours a day as it is. I mean, it just doesn't happen. So I mean, the fact that this kind of sets up this structure where again, you know, I wouldn't say it's 2,500. There is a strategic, you know, you're shooting for the high priority thing. So there's more value anyway. And you show up with really a package and says, look, we've got the local partners ready. We can come in and do. We know what we need to do. You know, we can do it if you let us do it. And I think most often, they're going to want you to do it, but you know, they just can't do it themselves. So I can really see, I mean, I like that a lot. I mean, we have a small manufacturing business. I wish we had the same thing with DEQ or something. I mean, suddenly you get something about, you know, zinc. Okay, well, all your buildings or your roofs are zinc, and you come in and you have to comply with this. By the way, there's no real way to comply with it, but you have to go spend a bunch of money to try to comply with it. No one comes in and helps us comply. I mean, I'd love it. You know, we'd love it. So, I mean, I think this is a you know, super valuable program, and it just, again, it's micro. It's as I said yesterday, and this stuff's going to go on forever.
Yeah.
But that doesn't mean that's bad. It's going to go on forever, and we're going to keep making it better. And as you mentioned earlier, conditions change. It's not even it's not like a static world out there. And having this stuff in place is fantastic. It's great.
Oh, Randy Labby, for the record. I too am really excited about this. I wondered if, as this program evolves, whether you foresee or it is possible that private sector could also be a source of funding for this. I think that there are instances that I can think of where private sector would come forward and it would, you know, validate the work in the eyes of the landowner to a greater extent. So I'm not asking you to respond, just an idea.
Yeah, the Maida Lofsgarden, for the record, the piece that I would throw out in this, I think, twofold. One, your strategic plan speaks directly to this. If we set these up right and we have these strategies and we know where we need to invest, that state-level funder partnership that we talked about, where OWEB can come in as a funder in conversations with others, I think we start to provide, here's a bucket. If your interest is water quality, if your interest is working with farmers, here's a bucket for you. In addition, you've probably seen that there's a cap and invest bill coming forward, and we see some strong potential there for some of the work that's being done on farmland that may be able to be involved in something like a cap and invest program. So I think there are a number of options that we could look at in that realm.
Okay. Thank you very much, and that's exciting. We're going to take a 10-minute break for the older members of the board. And so we'll reconvene at 10:20.
Beverages are once again hot.
It's Randy Labby, and the chairs are anxious to stay on schedule and request that that the board reconvene wherever they are. We're going to move here in a few moments to item N on our agenda, the Oregon Agricultural Heritage Program, which includes a public comment period, but I'm not certain there are any public comments signed up for.
I think we're good. All right. Do you want us to go ahead and start?
Can you proceed?
Yes. For the record, Maida Lofsgarden, Executive Director.
And for the record, Nellie McAdams, Oregon Agricultural Heritage Program Coordinator.
So I am very excited that Nellie is here because in the future it will be Nellie presenting all of this stuff to you. We brought Nellie on in September to help us manage this program as a result of some funding that we received from the state legislature. So we are thrilled to have Nellie. Her background and her experience is extensive in this area, and she will be helping us as we work through the details. So today we're going to provide you an overview of where we're at with the Oregon Agricultural Heritage Program since it was approved in July. We are also going to be requesting the board approve initiation of the rulemaking process. So that is the motion that we will have before you at the end of this. So just a little bit of background reminder about the program. I know I've talked with you a number of times about this program over the last 2 years, and we are very excited that the work group was able to get the program passed in the 2017 legislative session. The funding for the program was not approved except for a small amount of funding to initiate the program and appoint the commission and go through the rulemaking process. I actually believe that that is a really good step, given how tight funding was in this last legislative session. That any funding was provided is great. And it was going to take us quite a bit of time to put together the commission and the rules anyway, so this gives us a really good amount of time to put together a solid process and then come before the next legislative session to ask for funding to implement. So as a reminder, the program is designed to develop voluntary tools that help keep land in farming and ranching, but for 3 reasons. It's not just about farming and ranching, it's the support for Oregon's economy, for healthy rural communities, and healthy fish and wildlife and other natural resources. And I'll call that last piece out because in many states, when they run farm ranch programs similar to the one that we'll be talking about today, they are specifically solely about keeping farms and ranches in farming ranching. In Oregon, we have an interesting backdrop in that we have a fairly strong land use law in the state. And it actually does a fairly good job of keeping land that is farms and ranches in farms and ranches until the minute that the urban growth boundary jumps, right? And then all of that land that was in farms and ranches is suddenly in high density development or commercial development or other things. But compared to other states, and many of you have lived in other places, it's pretty unique, the land use laws that we have in Oregon. What that doesn't necessarily do, however, is ensure that those lands are viable and are supporting Oregon's economy, and that the lands are in the condition that support healthy fish and wildlife populations and other natural resources. So in Oregon, that focus really is broader than what you might see in other states. This information I've had before you in the past, and it's again in your staff report as well under agenda item N. It is the state's second largest economic driver. It supports habitat. It is the cornerstone of our rural communities, and our land use laws just are not enough to prevent farms and ranches from fragmentation. Fragmentation may look different in Oregon. It may be taking a 10,000 acre ranch into a series of 2,000 acre ranches, whereas in Colorado or Montana that would be 20 acre ranchettes. But it is fragmentation nonetheless, and when you fragment to a certain level, you're not able to run a viable operation. Conversely, we also see a growing number of operations, and Randy and I were just talking about this yesterday, where they're being purchased and becoming larger operations because it's not able to be supported as a family operation, and it makes it more difficult to pass those farms and ranches on to the next generation or to neighbors. Goals are here. It's about farms and ranches, fish and wildlife habitat, having some very flexible approaches. Courtney mentioned when we were talking about grant offerings earlier, we have a number of them at OWEB. We actually have 17, I think, going on 18 different grant offerings. I think we're really good at understanding the need for flexible approaches that are tailored to landowners, that really respond to what landowners' needs are. It's a strong balance between landowner needs and conservation needs. The other component that came strongly into the conversation during the legislature is looking over to the corner where Ron is sitting. We have not done a good job in Oregon of leveraging federal funds that are designated for this type of program. So reminder, this program would not be funded through Measure $76. Currently the money that's available is general fund. And it's part of the reason, we'll talk about the commission shortly, but it's part of the reason that a separate commission is being established with oversight from the OWEB board, because the funds have a different purpose. It is a purpose that is incredibly complementary to what OWEB does, but it is not a purpose that OWEB dollars, Measure $76, or Pacific Coastal Salmon Recovery dollars could fund specifically. The statute that was passed establishes a fund. It didn't put a dime into the fund, but it did establish a fund. And then it established the commission to oversee the investments of the program. We talk a lot, and you'll hear a focus on conservation easements, working land conservation easements and covenants. That's a lot of what the conversation was during the legislature about this program. We want a program to provide easements for landowners. But I want to remind this group that it's actually about a lot more than that. And I'm pretty excited about some of the potential if we can find funding. Back to Will's point earlier, there's some pretty cool stuff that got passed in this program. One piece, and a piece where Nellie has an incredible amount of expertise, is succession planning for landowners. What we tend to find is that small family operations either have a really difficult time having the conversations that they need to have. It's tough when you have 3 kids and potentially 5 grandkids, and you're trying to figure out what to do with an operation. And you know that one kid might want to take over the farm, but what do you do with the other ones, and how do you make that equitable? And oftentimes what happens is the conversation may not happen, the land gets sold, or the one child who takes over the operation is left trying to figure out how to buy out the others, or it is managed by everybody even though one person is on the farm, and it's just tough. It is really tough, and it's tough to have those conversations. So succession planning is a key part of this. We were asked why we provide that for agriculture and not other small businesses. And one, there are opportunities for small business owners to talk about succession planning. 2, it's a public benefit. These lands, we want them to stay in production. We want them to stay as healthy, productive lands. It's a little bit different when we're talking about a land base. And so we see a strong public benefit to making sure those lands are well managed and stay in working farms and ranches. The second piece is the working land easements. The third piece that I'm very excited about would be to fund conservation management plans. So NRCS since the 20s has been working with landowners to do good conservation plans on their farms. We pay for pieces of that. We pay for riparian habitat. We pay to put in fencing. We pay for many of the components, we pay to install them. NRCS just recently, through the Conservation Stewardship Program, has been paying landowners over 10 years to implement those plans and to add innovative practices. What we're proposing is a stateside counterpart to that, where over 30 to 50 years we would pay landowners who are implementing a solid conservation plan to implement that plan. So if, for example, on Gary's ranch, he needs, I'm going to make up numbers, $450 an acre to make a living. And the conservation plan that we put in place reduces the number of animals that he can run on that operation, so he's only making $350 an acre. That's a public benefit that we need to pay for. So how can we pay that operation $100 an acre to do the kind of work that is providing a public benefit over the long term? And to support that work of conservation plans with some real dollar incentives behind it. And the last piece is technical support for all of those components. There's another component that is through the Legislative Policy Office that will be studying tax-related barriers to farm and ranch land transfer. That's outside of our purview, but that was also another piece of the bill. So what's your job in this process? First off, today we will be asking you to approve rulemaking. But the statute provides some very specific roles for OWEB. There will be a board, the Oregon Agricultural Heritage Commission, that is established through this statute. I'll step to this later, but there are a number of boards and commissions who are designated to recommend people to that commission. The OWEB's board's job is to then provide the final approval of that commission. So a number of boards will be recommending folks to you. You're the stamp of approval for that commission, and that commission serves within the purview of the Oregon Watershed Enhancement Board. It's different for us, but it is not new for other agencies. So I just want to pause for a second. There are a number of other agencies who have boards and commissions that operate under them: the Soil and Water Conservation Commission, the State Weed Board, at Oregon Department of Agriculture. There are ATV and other commissions under the Department of Fish and Wildlife and the Fish and Wildlife Commission. So this happens in a number of other agencies in different forms, where there's something that is very explicitly focused on soil and water conservation or on weeds that sits within an agency. The commission, for example, the chair of the commission right now for ODA is also the chair of the Board of Agriculture. So there are a lot of places where this happens. It feels new to OWEB, but it's not unique within state service that you have a commission that has a very unique purpose, and that commission is reporting to the OWEB board. Because you are the oversight commission, you will also be adopting the rules that are developed by the commission and a rules advisory committee. You will be jointly working to appoint review committees. Part of the reason that this commission was placed within OWEB is we do a really good job of providing independent technical review for grants and projects. And so they wanted to make sure there was that connection with the type of technical review that we would expect for these programs. And then once the commission recommends funding for a suite of projects, you approve those fund expenditures based on the commission recommendations. So the commission membership, and this is provided, actually I don't think I have it, yeah. Sorry, I have to look at the handouts that we provided you. I don't have this table. It is provided in the statute that's attached, so we pulled it out into a table for you. The Board of Agriculture will be recommending 4 individuals who are actively engaged in farming and ranching. The Board of Agriculture will also be recommending 1 individual with expertise in agriculture water quality. The Fish and Wildlife Commission will recommend to you 2 people with expertise in fish and wildlife habitat. The Land Conservation and Development Commission, 1 with expertise in conservation easements. OWEB itself will be recommending 1 individual with natural resource value interests, 1 individual with tribal interests, and OSU Extension has already actually recommended 1 person representing Extension. In addition to this, there will be 1 ex officio member who is a board member of OWEB who will sit on the commission. So you will always have somebody from your board who is sitting in on those conversations and involved in the discussions around the commission decision-making process. I'm going to pause there before I jump into the timeline and just see if you all have any questions about what we've walked through so far. All right, so in terms of process, I'll go kind of big picture on the commission itself because that's of largest interest. The applications for commission membership are due today. And we've received how many?
About 20 so far.
20, excellent.
Yeah.
So we've received 20. Those all came to OWEB. But the way that Nellie set up the application process, you could check a box and say, I'm interested in the, being the Fish and Wildlife representative or the agriculture representative. You could check multiple boxes if you had background in multiple areas. Those applications then will go out to the departments who will be coordinating the selection of their members. So OWEB is not coordinating the selection for any of the other board appointments. That goes to their group. So it is the responsibility of the Board of Agriculture to appoint people who are active in farming and ranching and who have diverse commodities and geography. It is not, OWEB is not making that designation for them. They'll be making that designation themselves. They will be, staff will, in each of those agencies, will bring forward to their respective commissions recommendations at their upcoming board meetings in November or December, whenever those meetings are. Yeah, Bob.
Bob Weber, in terms of you had applications, then you send them over to the agency. Is the agency limited to those applications, or is the agency, okay, so.
Yeah, and this was not in statute, but we sat down the agency directors. There were a couple of commissions. There's actually one that I think is under DLCD. The Ocean Acidification Commission was happening at the same time. And we made the decision that we wanted a really open and transparent process for both of those. So we broadly announced an application. It was in a number of newspapers around the state. We sent it to our Gov delivery, which is thousands of people, and all of our partners sent it out, and we decided amongst all of the agencies that we really needed to stick with a transparent application process. So it will come only from those applications received. Gary.
Gary Marshall, what's this going to mean in terms of staffing changes for OWEB?
So at this point in time, the staffing change for OWEB is represented here by Nellie.
Okay.
In the future, it depends a little bit on what the rulemaking process entails and what the program, as designed and implemented, what the program would look like. What we would do then with that is go back to the legislature next session and make a request for additional staffing for this program based on how the program is designed. So for example, the succession planning component is envisioned to be run through OSU Extension. So that is not something that OWEB needs to staff up for. OSU Extension will be coordinating that on our behalf with funding. But other components, the management plans, the conservation easements and covenants, will require additional staffing, so we'll request it at that time. All right, so timeline, in September we hired staff and then began the process of this commission and also rules advisory committee selection. So one of the things that's described in the statute is the group who will be developing the rules is the commission plus any other expertise that we feel is needed. And so it may be that folks who apply to be members of the commission may not become members of the commission, but they may be really critical for the rulemaking process, or there may be other expertise we need to bring to the table. So the statute provides for both of those pieces, and we're going to be doing that simultaneously. We'll be asking for the RAC process to be approved by you all. In January, you would be approving the commission at your January board meeting, so we will have all of the recommendations from all of the boards by then. In addition, we will be bringing to you our recommendation for the 2 positions that OWEB has to fill, and we'll be asking for your approval of that slate of folks in January. And then our hope is that we will hold the initial commission and RAC meeting pretty immediately after the next board meeting so that we can kick off the rulemaking process. Is there a question, Dan?
On the scope of the rules, are just like supposed to be the rules for everything you're going to be thinking about eventually, including grant? I mean, everything going on. So not just base administration and then.
Yep.
It's a lot of rules.
Yeah, the statute, which is provided to you all as attachment B, which I'm certain that you guys memorized and highlighted in your pre-reading materials, actually does a really good job of providing the base information. There's a lot actually in statute. So the rules, I think, will look a lot like what OWEB's rules are. What does the review team process look like specifically, and I think most importantly, what are the ranking criteria for these projects, which will be the most debated part of the conversation. So really, there's a super strong foundation in the statute. The rules will be then based on how we implement the various grant programs.
This is Dan again. I guess, this is not really incidental. I think it's kind of key to a lot of it. How does a program intend to deal at all with how to accommodate leased lands? I mean, I know so many agricultural operators now who primarily operate on leased lands, especially a lot of younger folks, and their agricultural lands usually owned by somebody who's owned them for a long time, but they're no longer actively. The way I read this, it's owner or operator. I mean,
yep.
The way the statute works, I can see that's not precluded, but I'm not sure how you do it. But I mean, I think that's got to be a pretty important part of the picture.
Yeah, Maida Lofsgarden. Actually, we've got a really good partner in NRCS in this area who has figured this out over a number of years on our behalf. And so an example would be on the easements and termed covenants, the ones that are tied to a deed but not permanent. That has to be with the owner, right? It's tied to the deed. You can have all the conversations you want to with the operator, but at the end of the day, that has to be the owner. The conservation management plans, with permission of the owner, you can work directly with the lessee. And so there are, I believe, a number of areas that, and that's done through EQIP and other programs with NRCS, where as long as you have permission of the landowner and they're okay with that work being done, then your conversation is directly with the lessee. All right, so between March and August, this is an incredibly intensive time period, and The reason this is intense is because our hope is to go back to the 2019 legislative session with the rules in place and having actually run a quasi-grant cycle. And that would be by next year, February. So you guys know that is incredibly tight. So the time period between actually February and June in particular, we will be meeting probably monthly, day-long meetings with the Commission and the Rules Advisory Committee to develop the rules around this program. The goal of that is that we would hopefully bring you the rules at your June board meeting for approval. It will have gone through a number of public hearings during that time. So again, in this case, the Commission is doing all of the public hearings. We will be holding public hearings during each of the meetings, allowing the public to join in and participate in an appropriate manner. So what you will have gone through the full rulemaking process. We hope to bring it to you in June. October would be the backup because it is a very tight timeline. That said, again, the statute has a lot of the construct that we need to work from. And then we will be developing what we're calling a pre-application. The reason we will not be running a full application process is, for those of you who've been involved in acquisitions for a long time, a full acquisition application is an incredible amount of work between the land trust and the landowner. Developing the conservation easement, putting together title reports, getting the appraisals done, all of that is really hard, and we don't have a dime in the fund. And so to ask landowners to go through that process with no guarantee, not only that they won't get funded, but that anybody will get funded, seems like a path too far. On the flip side, we want to be able to show the legislature what the true demand is. So we need a robust enough process that we can understand, are there 2 landowners out there? Are there 40 landowners out there? Who's ripe and ready for this process? So we'll be running that really to prepare the legislature to understand what the level of demand is. In conversations with NRCS, conservation districts, and others, what we understand is that the demand is big. And I think would far exceed what we would be able to even request from the legislature, but we need to be able to prove that. Then between September and February, we would consult. We would have those applications submitted. We would do site visits if they were appropriate. The staff would provide a report to the Commission of what was received, and the Commission would then provide a report to the board. In this case, you are not approving anything because there's nothing to approve. There is no funding. But really just reporting to you what we've seen in terms of demand. And then the legislative session begins in February of 19. So I'm going to stop there before we ask for your approval for the rulemaking and just see if there are any additional questions that you all have about the program. Alan?
This is Alan. The structure that's set up for the board now is that many of our entities that work with us move through a subcommittee. And the subcommittee is part of the board, and over time we've built trust and understand and accept, but maybe not agree with subcommittee members' decisions or proposed options or what have you. But it is part of the board and it represents that unity. In the RAC process, will we be establishing a subcommittee that the Commission comes to with the proposed rules, or is the idea that the board gets the draft rules for approval and that's it?
Really good question. So in this case, and I know it feels very different, and that's why I raised at the beginning, OWEB has never had this before, but other boards and commissions have had it for a long, long time. The Commission really does become your subcommittee, and it's one of the reasons that we have a liaison between the two and that you are appointing 2 members independent of that to the Commission. We will be reporting to you regularly, so Nellie will be in front of you saying, here's what the draft looks like, getting your feedback and comments. We are actually going to try and tie the Commission meetings kind of right next to board meetings where that works. But in this case, they become your subcommittee. And so we won't be establishing a separate subcommittee for this process, in part because we really need them to become that entity for you. And we want to establish right off the bat that that is how they're operating. And I know it does feel very different for you all. It isn't different when we work with other agencies who have a similar process. So in this case, they will be operating as your subcommittee.
And it is going to be a new paradigm for us.
Yeah.
And so I suggest a lot of spoon feeding,
Yep.
nurturing going on so that we establish that relationship and that association.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you for that.
Okay,
Questions?
is the board ready for board action on this item?
Was there, Jason, did you have anything, or you were?
I did have just one comment, thanks. Rita.
Jason?
Jason Robinson. So as we look at the really tight time frame on this and the onboarding of new board members, is this discussion part of the onboarding that is occurring with new board members as we start bringing them up to speed, since there's going to be a lot of tight timelines and decisions in this process? So thank you.
Absolutely. It has not been part of the onboarding in the past because we didn't have the program to onboard with. But yes, we have. So we have, like I mentioned before, 4 new board members coming to us in January, and this will be part of their conversation. Rosemary?
Rosemary?
Rosemary, thank you, Maida. Very interesting presentation. And I want to follow up on Alan's, that kind of the cross-fertilization and understanding and that nurturing. If there are also ways in which programs that, I know there's no money right now, but there may be the pre-applications and landowners that have come forward, if it can be brought, or the information can be brought forward either to our existing subcommittees or report to the board on how those programs through this new heritage program are dovetailing with our programs as well. I think we need to know that to see where there's momentum being built in certain watersheds or addressing key issues. We just heard about water quality impacts from agriculture and trying to look at prioritization. So I hope we can always be seeing where there's the alignment, maybe where there isn't and there should be. But so that's brought forward, and I know we'll have 2 members on that commission, but I think always being explicit to see where that alignment where are the needs, where are the gaps, and how we can work together and understand each other's roles.
Yeah.
But be partners, but
Yeah.
there's clearly a distinction, but we need to know what the overlap is.
Yeah, and thank you for that, Rosemary. Interesting that you raised the water quality piece, because one of the big things that came up during session consistently was, well, how does this tie to the state's agriculture water quality program? And what we described in that process is this program is not designed to implement the ag water quality program, but we think it could provide huge benefit. We think as we do conservation management plans, if we actually get the funding that Randy mentioned, with private sponsorships, or that Lisa and I talked about with the Cap and Invest program, we have phenomenal potential for this program to really dovetail nicely with some of the things that we're trying to do to provide that base of protecting the land, and then we add things like the EQIP program or conservation stewardship or management plans on top of that. To speak to, and I should have said this when Alan was asking the question, we absolutely expect that this becomes a standing agenda item with your board. So similar to the subcommittees that are operating in other areas, our expectation is that this commission is reporting to you regularly, and that we are talking about those links and those connections, and I think even more formally than what we do with our 5-minute subcommittee reports, because there are things that are going to just perfectly tie and dovetail. So our expectation isn't that you are completely hands-off. Our expectation is that you treat them just like you're working with these other subcommittees, and that they are regularly reporting to you, whether that's through the liaison staff or actually having some joint conversations with the commission and the board.
Bob?
Bob Weber. Maida, my understanding, if I got it right, was the Agricultural Heritage Commission will pretty much be drafting the rules?
Along with additional members of the Rules Advisory Committee. But yes, that's the way the statute is.
Okay, so, and when are we appointing those members?
In January.
So why are we doing rulemaking before the board or the commission that's going to do the rulemaking exists?
Thank you for the question. You are not, they are not, we are not starting rulemaking now. We're asking you to approve the process because basically the minute that the commission is appointed, they're going to be starting on their work. And so what we wanted to do is just separate out the timeline. So you approve that now, so we're ready to go. The next meeting you approve the commission, they start their rulemaking. So there will be no rulemaking starting before you approve the commission in January, but we just wanted to line out all the parts so that we could get this piece approved now. But there will be no rulemaking between now and January.
So what's the advantage of doing it today versus then?
The only advantage was we wanted to separate out the motion so we could talk to you about this, bring you one motion now, talk to you about the commission in January and get their approval. So it was more our staff trying to get these concepts in front of you multiple times. You could wait until January if you wanted to. I don't think there's an advantage or disadvantage to doing it now or in January. I promise we won't do anything nefarious between now and then.
Thank you.
Ron.
Ron Alvarado, have you guys thought about a funding level at this point? Thinking ahead?
For the record, Maida Lofsgarden, I've thought about so many funding levels, and they well exceed, I think, things that we could realistically ask for. In the last biennium, we had approached with a $5 million funding amount basically as an initial pilot. So that was, let's think on the low side and see what we could come up with. We do not have a funding amount in mind right now, and it's part of the reason I'm very interested in going through that pre-application process, because my gut says 5 million is pretty low for what the need actually is out there for high quality projects in the state, but we won't know until we see what's coming in the door, and we won't know how that's staged over time. So I can't speak to a dollar amount. The work group is also doing a great job of thinking through what the appropriate funding sources might be. So there's some work going on with the work group that developed this legislation. They're doing some really good thinking about, what are the funding sources that would be appropriate? How can we appropriately make this ask? So we'll be doing that in partnership with the folks who helped to approve this program to begin with. That is, I want to be clear, that is separate from the rulemaking process. The commission will not be figuring out what the fund sources are and things like that. That really is more in the political and legislative process than the rulemaking process.
Just to follow up on that, I think we have plenty of experience on NRCS's side in terms of the number of applications, number of funded easements, could at least help with gauging what that would be. Is just my...
That would be excellent.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Debbie.
So, Debbie Holland for the record. So just, kind of in my ongoing role as the one member at the table who speaks to forestry, since we're losing or haven't had a good forestry rep, Board of Forestry rep, I just want to continue to highlight around this program the recognition of the conflicts and that forest landowners were not necessarily included in this conversation as it has developed. But reading the statute, it doesn't appear that they're excluded in the statute.
That is accurate.
Okay, I'm glad to hear that. And so then I would want to just continue to encourage the connections that could be made between OWEB, this commission, ODF, and the Forest Stewardship Program for those small non-industrial tree farmers who could benefit from the same types of incentives around promoting fish and wildlife habitat in their forested lands and struggle with the same issues that have been identified of the kind of the more traditional agricultural lands, succession planning, those kind of things. I mean, the tree farmers are struggling with exactly the same issues around how to keep their working lands working. And often they have or they can have an agricultural component. Some of the tree farmers run cows, do grazing, et cetera. But some of them are really just tree farms. And so just kind of keeping that connection in mind as we move forward, because there are ways to leverage that ODF funding that the Forest Service supports.
So two pieces to that. First, on this succession planning, the model we're actually using is a model developed for tree farmers that we will be transferring to agriculture. So we're really excited. We think that it makes the connection right off the bat. From the perspective of forest-specific easements, the ones that don't have an agriculture component, we are incredibly hopeful that our partners in the forest industry will see this program as it unfolds and see it as an opportunity and will be on board soon.
So part of that is outreaching to them to make sure they know about it.
They are very aware.
Okay, in lieu of further discussion or comments, the board entertain a motion from the co-chair or the board at large.
Will Newhouser, I move the board authorize rulemaking for the Oregon Agricultural Heritage Program.
Laura Masterson, I'll second.
Seconded by Laura. Is there any further discussion? All in favor, please signify by saying aye.
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 Opposed? Carried. Thank you, Meta and Nellie.
All right, Co-Chair Newhouser, so now we're moving to agenda item O in your book, the FIP implementation monitoring update with Renee, Robert Warren, and Ryan Houston.
Good morning, co-chairs, members of the board. For the record, Renee Davis, Deputy Director. I'm joined by Ryan Houston from the Upper Deschutes Watershed Council and also Robert Warren from Bonneville Environmental Foundation. Both of them are part of the BEF team that has been helping OWEB to develop a progress monitoring framework for the implementation FIP. So we're focused on agenda item O. Carl, this is in honor of you. We are ending the meeting on results chains. So one note, please do pull out also attachment A that was in your blue folder. It's titled Focused Investment Partnerships, a Framework for Monitoring Progress. So we'll be referring to that as we move through the presentation today. Also, I'd mention, I think, so Todd Reeve from BEF is also way in the back of the room, so we're thrilled that Todd could be here today too. So the intent of the work with BEF and OWEB is to establish a progress monitoring framework for the implementation FIPS. And if you look at the bottom of page 1 of the staff report for agenda item O, this is really about having a practical and consistent framework for both measuring and communicating about, one, implementation progress, so really those outputs that we're seeing with the implementation FIPS, but then also looking towards what are those ecological outcomes? How are we starting to move the dial relative to ecosystem function and process, not just how many acres or miles are we restoring. So part of the development of this framework is to provide a tool to the implementation FIPS that they can use in adaptive management. As they learn, they can take those learnings and circle that back into future implementation work. So the key here is really around having a common and consistent framework, but one that can reflect the unique nature of the implementation FIPS. Each of those 6 FIPS, even if you look at the 3 native fish FIPS alone, each one is very different. And so we want to make sure that we have a consistent framework, but one that can embrace some of those nuances and unique features. So 2 points that I want to just make briefly before I turn it over to Robert and Ryan is one, a timing issue. We did not have the luxury of having gotten BEF on board to help us develop the progress monitoring framework in advance of actually awarding implementation FIP funding. So given this, we are now getting the framework in place. We will have the opportunity to apply that with each of the implementation FIPS, but we have not yet really secured and embraced those lessons from this to determine how might we adapt or adjust or refine future solicitation processes. So as you are seeing the FIP solicitation go out for this next cycle, we are not, in fact, saying we are incorporating a results chain or some type of theory of change approach in that, but we fully expect to come to you with learnings from this experience and potentially propose future refinements for solicitations for implementation FIPS in other biennia. The second piece is that what you're seeing today is BEF's presentation of this information on behalf of the implementation FIPS. The FIPS alone did not author this information. It was developed by BEF in coordination with the implementation FIPS, but just want to be really clear. We've asked BEF to develop the progress monitoring framework, sketch that out to reflect the situation with each of those implementation FIPS, but this is so that you understand what the tool and the framework look like from the board and the agency's perspective. This is not something that each individual FIP has developed on their own, kind of in a vacuum. This is definitely the coordinated roll-up from BEF. So just to be clear about that, we will have many subsequent conversations with each of the implementation FIPS about the what next, what from here in particular associated with the monitoring piece. So with that, I'll turn it over to Robert and Ryan.
Great, thanks Renee. So we're really happy to be back again to sort of provide you with an update on progress. I think it's a pretty significant update from what we presented to you last July. But before we get into our presentation, I just want to highlight, or at least offer a quick note on how some of the findings from the Partnership Learning Project are now sort of being exported outside of Oregon. Jennifer Arnold, who did that presentation, is leading that work. She was invited to submit an abstract by the River Network to do a 90-minute workshop, to lead a 90-minute workshop on partnership management. And also we've been sharing the report with some other funders that we work with in other states as well, and so one funder in particular has sent the report out as far as Kentucky and Texas. So I think it's really exciting to see that there's interest in what's happening here in Oregon that might provide some benefit to folks thinking about funding watershed work in other places. So there's more opportunities for that to come along, so I just wanted to highlight that. So a quick overview for our presentation today. So first we'll talk briefly about process. It's going to be a bit of a review from our last presentation, but we'll spend very little time on that. And then walk you through one example of these FIPS summaries that you've got in your package. So we developed these summaries in collaboration with the FIPS for each one of the partnerships. And then what we're hoping to do is spend most of the time on some of the key observations. And some of these key observations might look a little bit like recommendations, but they're not. We believe we have a lot more work to do with OWEB staff and with the FIPS themselves to really develop some specific recommendations, as Renee's saying, in the future that might help in the continued evolution and development of this program. And so one thing that and this sort of echoes a little bit of what Renee was talking about, is that we recognize that this process is being really iterative, and that we're actively learning, every day that we meet or sit down with a FIP, or every time we read some of their materials. And so our thinking is continually being influenced by those interactions and by what we're learning in the field. And that the initiatives themselves are very dynamic. So each of the FIPS, the partnerships themselves are changing over time. The context of their work and the circumstances of their work is changing as well. And so things are different, not necessarily dramatically different, but they're different from when they first developed their strategic action plans and when they first developed their application materials to become implementation FIPS. So just keeping that in mind. So real quick, a review on the process. So basically what we did is we took all the materials so that we could find that FIPS had used to develop their strategic action plans and to develop their applications to develop these draft results chains. Those draft results chains were then presented to each of the FIPS where we had some conversation and discussion. We answered questions, we made some adjustments, but we also recruited sort of a smaller working group with each FIP to help us go a little bit deeper to refine those results chains and crosswalk tables to make sure that they accurately represented their initiative and their work. We took those updated results chains back to the full FIPS, presented them again, had more discussions, answered questions, made some adjustments, and then asked for their approval that these results chains and these crosswalk tables were in a state that would be appropriate for us to present to you today. So that's what you see as part of the summaries in the attachment. And real quick, as we've been, I guess as you full well know, and we've been talking about results chain, they're sort of at the core or foundation of the approach that we're taking here as a process and a tool to help partners identify specific objectives, both on the implementation side and on the ecological outcome side, things that they can measure in order to determine progress, to support their theories or to validate or invalidate their assumptions. So using that as the basis for identifying things to measure, to show, and demonstrate progress. So we've developed these summaries. So we've taken all this information in an attempt to distill what was often lengthy and dense information in the strategic action plans, but trying to retain those core elements and develop, these manageable, easy to read, easy to share summaries for each of the FIPs. And so we're going to walk through one of those. So we were really sort of conscious and careful not, who would we pick? So we wouldn't want to show favoritism to any one of the FIPs. And in truth, any of the FIPs would be appropriate for this sort of a process. And then somebody suggested, well, let's, in honor of Dan Thorndike's last meeting, let's pick the Ashland one. But then here I'm learning today that there's 3 board members that are leaving, so now we're showing favoritism to Dan. So I think we just can't get away from this favoritism. Or we can do this in honor of all the board members who this is their last meeting. So anyway, so we picked Ashland for no particular reason other than the reason that I guess, explained. So if you take a look at this one, the first 2 pages really are sort of contextual in nature. This is information that we drew directly from their applications and their strategic action plans. No surprises here. It's got the vision as defined by the FIPs. It has the members of the partnerships. It has the ecological priorities, so the OWEB defined ecological priorities that are the focus of their work. And in addition, in some cases, additional species were identified as a focus for these FIPs too, and so we identified those as well, whether they be fish species or upland or terrestrial species as well. So the second page contains the geographic scope. With a map just for reference. The operational context, which is turning into really an important piece, but we'll talk a little bit more about that in depth later on. And these figures are going to be unique for each of the different FIPs. So the next 2 pages is what we call the theory of change. And so essentially that's sort of a narrative form of the results chain, the sort of taking these boxes and arrows and sort of trying to describe that with text. And so in these pages, we offer the situation, which is the circumstances and events that have led to the initiative, so the reason why folks have come together to do this work. The approach, which is going to be the same in each one of these summaries, that describes how you use this document, how this narrative links to the results chain and then links to the crosswalk table. And then we get into the strategies. So in that piece, each strategy is specifically defined, and that's where you sort of see the meat of the results chain, so a description of how those strategies are expected to lead to outcomes, whether they're implementation outcomes or ecological outcomes. And you'll notice in the blowout that there is the superscript on some of these results, and those numbers in the superscript link to the numbers in the results chain, which I'll show you here in a second, and link to the numbers that are contained in the crosswalk table as well. So there's a way to sort of read this theory of change or the results chain both as text, both as a figure showing the relationships between the results, and then the details around objectives that I'll show you, the objectives and the metrics that I'll show you in the crosswalk table. So this is where the results chain is, and again, you're going to be seeing unique results chains for each one of the FIPs that represent their work, their theories of change. And you'll see the numbers here. So the numbers in the upper left-hand corner of those rectangles match the superscript numbers in the narrative, and again, will match the crosswalk table. And as a reminder, you've got the blue rectangles, which are implementation results, the lavender rectangles, which are ecological outcome results. And then for those that were interested in beginning to explore sort of the social side of this equation, we've got lavender boxes with brown text. And so some of the FIPs had the desire and interest to go a little bit deeper, but it's just, I think, really scratching the surface initial exploration on some of these, so you're not going to see a huge amount of detail, but just a beginning of that desire. We'll talk a little bit more about that further in the presentation. And then at the bottom of most of these, there's a paragraph talking about measuring progress, and that's just sort of framing up the monitoring approach that these FIPs are taking. So we indicate that on the same page as the results chain. And then finally, sort of the meat of it, sort of the details behind all of this is the crosswalk tables. So implementation progress, ecological progress. So again, those results that are numbered, and I should have let you know that those results were identified by the FIPS. So when we did the results chain exercise, we asked the FIPS to identify which results they would consider to be high priority for them to be able to tell the story of restoration and recovery, or identify results that potentially hold a lot of uncertainty, things that they would want to measure in order to validate their theory of change, and also results that they could potentially see change in near term, even within the time frame of their FIP funding. And within those, you'll see objectives that are pretty clearly defined for the implementation results, less defined for the ecological outcomes, and there's an explanation in those. If you look up at the upper part of that table, that in many cases, additional assessment, additional monitoring, investigation needs to be completed in order for them to define really specific objectives around ecological outcomes, even though they're able to identify conceptually what kind of outcomes they're hoping to achieve. And at the bottom, we have sort of a placeholder for status and trends, and that's just to make sure that those long-term ecological impacts associated with those priorities are captured. We've got an explanation that's the same for each of the summaries, indicating that the timescales over which you would begin to see some change in the status and trends of those species or populations or habitats fall well into the future and would require some coordination with agencies, academia, or other partners that are operating at the proper scale in order for them to show that change over time.
Okay, my name is Ryan Houston, and I'm going to give Robert a little break from talking here, and as we move into the portion of this where we're going to be talking about some of our observations and some of the considerations and some of the thoughts that are rattling through our heads as we're working through this project. We have in the memo that's in your packet, we have 11 observations. They're here on the slide, and my plan here is simply to highlight what these are, give you a very, very brief description of each one, and then we're going to dive a little bit more deeply into about 5 of them that I think are worth some deeper discussion. So think of these as observations, think of these as discussion prompts, think of these as things to explore at a deeper level. These are not necessarily recommendations because, as Robert had mentioned, this is sort of an iterative process, and we're in the process of trying to figure out exactly how some of these things play out. So I want to walk through these, and then we'll go a little bit more deeply.
So for those who are flipping through your book, the observations are on page 5 of the part that was in your blue folder.
Oh. Yeah, and don't feel the need to try to follow them necessarily in the memo. We'll talk about them here, and in the memo we have 2 or 3 paragraphs for each one that sort of expands on what we'll discuss here. We have these broken down into 3 categories: the framework, the partnerships, and the program. And so let me just go through and summarize them briefly. Under the framework, the first one is that results chains are, I think as most of us are starting to recognize at this point, very powerful tools to try to develop, communicate, articulate, and actually present the strategies that people are implementing in these fairly complex systems. They're powerful tools, but they also have some challenges and some limitations, and we'll talk about those. Strategic planning evolution. One of the things that we've recognized is, and I think Renee mentioned this in her introduction, is that this process of trying to layer these results chains into these existing FIPs is really a marrying of different strategic planning efforts, where the FIPs all came to the FIP programs with really robust strategic plans that were well thought out, well mapped out. We are now layering in these results chains, and so it will take some time for those to be integrated and actually evolve into one coherent thought. And that's simply because these results chains are coming in after strategic plans have already been built and have already developed quite a bit of momentum. Framework development and stewardship. One of the things we've recognized is that this framework is a beast in and of itself. It is a living, breathing experience that has its own requirements for skills and expertise and thought processes. And so for a framework like this to work over the long term, it needs time, capacity, energy from those people that have a keen interest in exactly this type of work. And if we look at many of the FIPs that were really built around on-the-ground implementation, sometimes the things that we're talking about in this framework, the FIPs weren't built to do that. And so one of the things we've recognized, and we'll talk about a little bit more deeply here, is just that we should recognize this framework as its own experience and its own process in and of itself that is complementary to the specialized expertise that the FIPs have on the ground. Partnerships. Partnership diversity, I think everyone here in the room knows that these partnerships are extremely diverse. And so the way in which this framework is applied across the 6 existing FIPs, as well as any future FIPs, really does need to be flexible. So there can be some consistent themes, but when we get down to the nuts and bolts, the actual application needs to vary with the individual FIPs, given how diverse they are and given how diverse the landscapes are in which they work. And that connects to the next bullet, operational context. Robert's going to dive more deeply into this in just a second, but each FIP operates in its own geographic context, its scope and scale of its place. It also operates in different social political contexts, and it plays a different role in the overall ecological restoration for that ecological priority. And so that operational context for each FIP is really important to keep in mind because it governs how we think of things, particularly the next bullet, which are the mechanics of monitoring. When each FIP is engaged in monitoring, the way it does its monitoring and the way that monitoring interfaces with other parties working in that landscape is really, really important to be clear about. So you take some of the FIPs where maybe they're working on specific on-the-ground projects in specific places. They may be monitoring that work, but that monitoring needs to be nested within the much larger consideration of the population scale, the larger watershed scale, the basin scale, whatever it may be. The program, integrating more social science and outcomes. All of the FIPs have expressed an interest in getting deeper into understanding more the social outcomes of their work, whether those are community, cultural, social, economic, those types of outcomes. Most of the FIPs have been built around ecological outcomes. The FIP program itself was largely built around ecological outcomes, but there's a keen interest in going deeper into some of those social elements. And I think there are quite a few opportunities to do that, given the structure and the nature of the work that the FIPs are doing. Integrating with OWEB strategic planning. As many of you know, OWEB already has a strategic action planning framework or format that was built for the FIP program. The idea here is that what we're looking at is not intended to replace that, but what we're talking about, and I think the real opportunity here, is to try to merge some of these concepts together. If you really look at the strategic action planning framework that OWEB has in place, it includes many of the elements that we're talking about here. And so these are very complementary efforts, and really all we need to do is think about how to make them efficient if they come together. Communications, those results chains are powerful tools. They can be used in certain kinds of communications, but not in others. They're still complex. They look like wiring diagrams. They are fairly detailed. That's very powerful in certain settings, but to take it to the next level and have communications that go to less technical audiences, broader audiences, there's a need to do that and an opportunity to do that, because once we have the powerful, clear, concise, explicit framework, we can then try to distill that down into some messaging that works. But the key thing I think we want to recognize is that in those results chains, we have the key elements of good storytelling. What are you doing and why, and what do you expect to achieve and when, and how are you going to get there? Those are really powerful things that we can distill into good communications. Reporting, we're distinguishing reporting from communications in the sense that reporting is about grant reporting, funder reporting, and one of the things that we want to pay attention to is that most grant reporting happens at the level of the grant agreement, at the level of the project, which in the context of these very large FIPs is a really small part of the overall effort. And so as we move forward, we need to think about how does communications work at the big picture, how does reporting work at the smaller sort of grant or project level scale, and how do we pull all of that together? And then finally, partnership capacity and human capital. All of this takes a fair amount of energy and a fair amount of expertise and work. So whether it's communications or social science or how we steward and navigate these frameworks, all of that takes capacity. And so one of the key things to think about in the future is what is the cost benefit in terms of using some of these tools for the FIPS. How do they have the capacity to do this work so that this doesn't become a mandate or another task that doesn't come with the associated capacity necessary for it to be done well. This can be done really well, but it does take a lot of work, and I think the art here is figuring out exactly how to do that. So now we're going to dive into a couple of those thoughts and spend a little bit more time on those details.
Okay, so operational context, something that we've been talking about quite a bit. We presented this idea at our last meeting. We recognized pretty early on that depending on how the FIP sort of drew lines around the geography or drew lines around the issues that they were wanting to focus on, or sort of programmatically, it varied across the FIPs and had real implications for implementation, had implications for monitoring and reporting as well. And so we've tried to capture this in this figure, capture this issue or idea, and trying to show how each of the FIPs might vary in terms of their operational context. So if you look at this figure, the outermost box is really the largest sort of relevant scale. And the colored boxes, or the colored rectangles, represent really the FIP scope. So the largest rectangle is the scope of the strategic action plan, so the line they drew around with their strategic action plan. The progress monitoring framework, which is what we're working on, really would mirror that. So the scope and the frame of monitoring would fit into the scope of the strategic action plan. And then the darkest color box is the FIP scope of work, so actions that they actually would implement during the 6-year time frame. So we took those boxes and then overlaid sort of a generic results chain that's still relatively specific to each FIP, and tried to figure out where do those different boxes, where do implementation results, where do near-term ecological results and long-term ecological results, and those long-term status and trends impacts, where do they fit within those different scales or those different contexts. And so in most cases, obviously, strategic actions and implementation results would be occurring within that 6-year time frame. You'd begin to see potentially some of those near-term intermediate ecological results as coming from those actions. Those longer-term results would probably take a little bit longer, but still would sort of fit within the frame of their monitoring work and the strategic action plan. The other piece that's important here is that in most cases, there are people doing that are not part of the FIP partnership, but are actually contributing to those outcomes as well. And so we have these lighter colored boxes that show other partners or constituents that are implementing strategies. Their results are actually contributing to those outcomes. In a lot of cases, those external partners or external entities are also doing monitoring. So there's opportunity for the FIPs to align or integrate monitoring that's happening sort of within the FIP frame to what's happening at the regional frame. And so as we've sort of talked about this, the FIPs are really structured around implementation, but they also rely on these outside partners to produce the results. So the question is, well, how do you report on, or what scale do you report on progress? So if progress is, or what scale do you report on implementation if all of these things are sort of contributing to the outcomes that you desire? So that's something that we're thinking through and trying to understand how best to represent that in this work. And this also comes into play in the reporting. Ryan was just talking about reporting. So if you're reporting on sort of project by project or a series of projects, who's telling the sort of the bigger story of the cumulative story of positive ecological change?
Okay, so the next one, strategic planning, evolution, and integration. Renee mentioned this in her introduction, or referred to this concept in the introduction, which is that all of the FIPs all of the partnerships came to the FIP program with robust strategic action plans, well thought out strategies and approaches for how they want to pursue their work and achieve their outcomes. At the same time, a framework like this is typically used early on in the planning process to do exactly that, figure out what it is you want to do and why and how to achieve some set of outcomes. And so as we explore this tool, I think it's worth recognizing that it'll take some time to marry what comes out of this process with the existing strategic action planning process, because folks came to the FIP program with momentum, with a whole series of things lined up. Many of those projects in their strategic action plans were probably under development for the previous 4, 5, 8, 10 years. And so what we have is a strategic action planning process that got people here and put them in a really good position to be successful as FIPs. We have this other thought process that can be used to augment strategic action planning, to really articulate strategic planning, and we want to give them time for there to be an integration here. We've already seen some really exciting conversation happen because the visual nature of these results chains triggers good conversation. People ask good questions, they challenge assumptions, that sort of thing. But I think it will take time for those initial series of activities to play through before this results chain planning process shifts from being a representation of what people are currently doing, which is what it is now, shifts from being that representation to actually being a driver of what they plan to do. And that is no way intended to be a criticism of what folks are doing, because I think the strategic action plans are outstanding. It's really how these processes come together. And so we're very sensitive to the fact that this is essentially a strategic planning process, and we want to be careful about adding another strategic planning process on top of existing strategic action planning, and really think about how those should play together through time. Powerful elements in both, take time to integrate them and think about them as we move forward. So just a thought and something to think about as you look forward to future FIP applications and continued work with FIP partnerships.
Great. So as Ryan mentioned, every FIP has expressed interest in integrating the social outcomes and social benefits in their work, and it's motivated mostly because they want to demonstrate how their work is benefiting communities, partly because that might be a goal in itself, but also because they want to build stewardship in the community. So as the community gains understanding, appreciation for the work, in order to sustain whatever gains they make through their implementation, it requires that the community stewards that work into the future. And so there's a real strong desire to build in those social outcomes. And the results chains allow you to do that. So you'll see in some of those results chains where that exploration has begun, that we talked about a little bit earlier. But for it to really sort of go further, it's likely going to require some specialized expertise. So working with social scientists with the different FIPs to identify more specifically what those linkages look like, what are the linkages between ecological outcomes and social outcomes, and potential benefits to human well-being and potential benefits to communities. And so there's definitely strong interest in that. Some capacity in terms of expertise is required to really take it to the next step.
Okay, communications. I think, results chain tell a fairly comprehensive and visual, yet often very complicated story about strategy, theory, expected outcomes, linkages, and so forth. And so therefore, they provide a lot of the basic ingredients for good storytelling, but in and of themselves, they're often too complicated and too detailed for broader storytelling. And so one of the things that is, I think, really interesting to explore here is how can we use this approach to work on communications at a number of different scales? How can we use it to articulate how specific actions pool together to achieve cumulative results or outcomes? Similarly, how can we scale up and look at how FIPs across the landscape contribute to achieve a larger set of ecological outcomes at a broader scale, maybe statewide scale, what have you, but really try to look at how can we take these tools and identify what stories can be told here, and how can we bring those up to offer communications to different audiences. So we could start at the highest level of, how is the FIP program contributing to OWEB's overall mission impact, big picture, all the way down to how is my work with this individual landowner to restore sage-grouse habitat on this property contributing to a big vision across the Great Basin for sage-grouse recovery. So trying to really look at these and recognize that there are different scales that we can use these tools and be creative about that. One of the challenges, of course, is that most FIPs were built around delivering ecological outcomes, not built around communications and communications expertise. And so the degree to which we want to try to amplify communications either within or across FIPS or cumulatively for all FIPS, there's probably a need or an opportunity to bring in more communications expertise to really figure out how to tell those stories. So there's an opportunity there. Doesn't necessarily need to be acted on, but if we do act on it, it's worth thinking about the capacity and the expertise to be successful with it. And this is our last observation before we get to next steps: framework development and stewardship. All the things we've discussed here, whether it's communications or context or monitoring, reporting, the integrating social outcomes, economic outcomes, whatever it may be, all of those things require a tremendous amount of expertise because each of them are disciplines in and of themselves. And one of the things we've recognized is, rightly so, most of the FIPS have been built with expertise to develop and implement on-the-ground projects. They tend to be staffed and sort of driven by folks who are really focused on those ecological outcomes because that's the original intent of the FIP program in general. However, this framework and sort of this process of developing this, managing it, stewarding it, communicating with all the partners, editing it, maintaining it, and using it to govern communications and monitoring and reporting and all of these things is a big task in and of itself. It's sort of an integrative discipline as opposed to an isolated discipline. And so one of the things that we've recognized through this process is that for this kind of an approach to be successful, there need to be folks who have dedicated, sort of focused energy on managing, owning, stewarding this framework. And that's one of those things where that's a unique skill set, requires a certain type of thinking, requires people who are really interested in this, and people who can then interface across their entire partnership to bring in all that expertise to make this successful. So it's sort of its own task in and of itself. It's a really exciting opportunity, but it's also one of those things where we shouldn't assume that all FIPS and each person or each partner within all the FIPS are either focused on doing that, have the capacity to do that, have the skill set or the interest to do that. So again, one of those things, if we want to invest in this and make it work, let's really think about how is it owned and how is it maintained as a living part of each FIP program to be successful.
Great. So next steps. So when we presented this the first time in July, we talked about, ideally this framework would provide value at all levels. We didn't want it just to be a tool for a funder to impose on groups to report. We didn't want it to be, anything specific, but we wanted to provide value at the funder level, at the implementers level, also to all the partners internal to the FIPS and partners external to the FIPS as a tool for communicating. And so what we're seeing as a really important next step is how do we really integrate this framework into the work that folks are already doing in order to maximize the value that it's going to be offering at all those different levels. And so we want to spend some time with FIPS that are interested, and we do have groups that are interested in sort of carrying this forward and making it more live than just representative of work that they're doing. We want to understand what capacity and resource needs would be required for them to do that, which is something that Ryan just talked about. We also want to make sure that we integrate the Partnership Learning Project in what we're doing. So Jennifer's out now talking to all the implementation FIPS, doing the same thing she did with the capacity building partnerships, trying to understand the same kinds of questions or answer the same kinds of questions with them. And so we believe that the results or the findings of that process will really help inform how we would potentially integrate some of these concepts into each of the partnerships. And one of the things that we talk about is, well, if we're going to be asking them to do more, we need to make sure that those resources are made available or that expertise is made available. But one other thing that is really required is that the FIPS need to have the interest and discipline to do that. They want to believe that there's value here, and they need to want to actually do it. And so that's something that we're hoping we'll get through some of Jennifer's work as well. So, thanks.
So before we open it for questions, for the record, Renee Davis, just want to mention a few more pieces from kind of staff and OWEB perspective about next steps. So one, going back to Ryan's comment about results chains are incredible tools. They may not be the best communication tool to use with all audiences. We're continuing to work with BEF on on sketching out some kind of concepts and frameworks for what might a simplified version of a results chain look like, just to be able to provide some of that initial food for thought that could be useful to each of the FIPs as they're thinking about how could we apply this tool, not just to help us track our progress, but also to communicate out about that progress to broad and maybe less technical audiences. So that's one piece. The next piece, which is really when we, I think, dig into the meat of this, is given the products that we have, knowing that they are living documents, obviously, and we hope that they continue to evolve and we learn from them. Staff are going to be engaging in conversations with each of the individual implementation FIPs, bringing BEF in. We definitely have, I think, really appreciated this partnership. So to the degree that we can keep BEF engaged as we follow up with each of the FIPs about what have you learned from the results chain process? Where have you identified monitoring gaps? Where have you maybe uncovered an area that you hadn't actually thought of initially when you were developing your monitoring framework for your FIP, and it's an area where you'd like some additional resources to explore? What might some of those communication or stewardship needs be that would help you continue to apply this very powerful tool as a very effective adaptive management tool in your FIP? So really digging into those conversations with each of the FIPs, also to gauge what is that appetite, I think, that you were just referring to. How much interest do they have in using this? To one, potentially bring to you then subsequently some funding requests, and likely that could be around additional monitoring resources that the FIPs might identify, potentially also some of those communications needs, some modest funding requests there. So just to tee up that this is just the start of this conversation with the board, and we do expect to have some pretty robust conversations with each of the FIPs, but then also really making sure that we as staff are tracking how is this being applied and how can we use this to inform the FIP process from here. I agree with Ryan. I don't think it's a wholesale throw out the strategic action plan process that we have in place currently, but figuring out how can we marry something like this that better captures theory of change in a quantitative fashion through time into our FIP solicitation process. So we want to make sure to get as many of those learnings out of this so that we can continue, I think, to bring you the most effective types of solicitations for this very important grant program. So with that, I'll end and see what questions you have.
Dan?
Yeah, Dan Thorndike. Well, I think what I really like about it, and I think the value, challenge is implementing it that way, is this is like really kind of lifetime monitoring. We're not like waiting. The traditional old-fashioned way is like, okay, here's your 5-year program. What happened at the end of 5 years? Did that work? Did that not work? Whatever. It's already happened or not happened. And if this really seems to be a pretty effective mechanism, just from the stuff today, you start thinking about all this stuff that's going on right now with ongoing FIPs. And the opportunity to be able to, as you said, whether it's adaptive management or whatever, but take advantage of whether it's a challenge, an opportunity, or whatever. And just by way of example, and I mentioned this to a couple folks where it came up from the social outcome side, which ties into the communication side, and all that is, so I'm involved with some cultural advocacy stuff around the state. They're all freaking out now about forest fires in the summer. It's a huge thing. From Oregon Shakespeare Festival, Cycle Oregon, the system, all sorts of stuff that happened, and it sort of has opened up some, I think, some lines of communication between kind of us, watershed geek type people with our little funny language in inbred societies. To folks who actually kind of, now again, funny, the executive director of OSF was going to go to the Forest Service and say, would you guys just put these fires out, please? And I explained, well, Cynthia, it doesn't really work that way, and in fact, we're working with all this stuff, and it's long-term, and you can do all this stuff. But I think the opportunity, and you get to communication, is an Oregon Shakespeare Festival or a High Desert Museum or something. They're pretty good at communicating stuff that's to a broader audience. And if we're seeing that kind of stuff popping up, now I'm just doing this kind of example. I mean, this is like just one train going out on that social outcome thing, where you see that popping up. You can, I think, reach out and take advantage of that opportunity right then and address some of these other observations you had about the challenges. And the Ashland Forest Plan is a good one there too, because I mean that has been very much communication-based issue about how do you do this kind of work close to going on. That's been more really very much up front, but even there, there'd be lots of opportunities to then take advantage of these other things. But anyway, it's great to see it being implemented, but again on a rolling basis, on an ongoing basis, on this kind of monitoring and getting that feedback to folks who can do something about it, rather than the old traditional, we're going to look at after it's too late. It's neat.
So I would say that highlights the need for a unique skill set to be the steward of this. So they see these opportunities and making these sorts of connections. So if it's somebody's job to really understand that, it's not a typical sort of monitoring, not that there's a typical monitoring person, but it's somebody who can see strategically and more broadly, make sure those connections are there. And a lot of these groups, some of the groups have already talked about, as they put out the results change, like, well, things have changed. When one person said, well, what I know today is different than what I knew yesterday, so things are always changing. So the idea that you have somebody stewarding and continually updating the results chain, looking at things, not that it's always sort of changing so fast that nobody can keep track of it, but that you have to respond and react to things. So that's
Randy, and then Carl.
Randy Lavey. My comment is similar to Dan's and Renee's reference to adaptive management. In the case of the Deschutes, Ryan, my one-track mind on this. It appears that, the investment that OWEB has made in SIPs and subsequently FIPs is potentially at risk to some degree due to water quality in the lower Deschutes. And, that was not at the outset, I would state, expected to be a major determinant. And it turns out that it very well might be. The science is still out and being argued and is not definitive, but at some point in time I would think that our monitoring of that FIPS project should include some reference to that potential problem. And it may be that down the road there's a way of bringing everybody together to address that, and OWEB could be a part of a solution. So it's just a suggestion I'm making. I think that there's so much good work going on by the watershed councils in addressing those issues on the Crooked and to a lesser degree the Deschutes, but the timeline is becoming a stress because the progress that's being made is going to take, at this level of progress, a generation or more to fix this, whereas we're hoping that the overall management plan of the Deschutes dams is going to reach their goals that have been set out in the FIPS project. So it's just a suggestion.
Yeah, Ryan Houston, I think what it highlights to me, for those of us that really do geek out on this stuff like you're talking about, Dan, is if you look into the reference that's included in our memo, it's the open standards for the practice of conservation. And these results chains are sort of a simplified version of that methodology. But one key part of that methodology that gets to exactly what you're talking about, Randy, is the development before you do a results chain of something called a conceptual model that is actually a graphical representation of how you think your system works. And that's the place where you layer in something like water quality or whatever it may be and articulate the degree to which that element or that issue, water quality, for example, does or doesn't get in the way of the thing you care about, like anadromous fish. And it's through that conceptual model that you first spend a lot of time talking with everyone. Do we all agree on how we think this ecological system works? Then you identify your interventions, and then you develop your results chain that then says, well, given that we think the system works this way, if we intervene with this strategy, we expect these results to occur. So there's a key element in there that for the purposes of keeping this streamlined, we have sort of glossed over in these conversations, but all of the FIPs currently have conceptual models written narratively in their strategic action plans because they've articulated how their system works and therefore why they want to do the strategies they're doing. So I think with a good conceptual model, that's exactly where you come back to it and you look at water quality, for example, and say, you know, we thought it wasn't that big of a deal, but guess what? It really is a big deal. Let's tweak this. And it creates a really good environment to have that conversation, a good framework for that conversation.
Thanks.
Carl?
I've expressed before how attractive this results chain is to me, and for several reasons. And I would like to hear from each of you your thoughts regarding going forward with it. What you've done and demonstrated here is this kind of layering the process onto a pre-existing one, which is onerous and maybe not ideal. But I'd like to hear going forward how each of you think in the future, instead of it being a retrospective, it's a prospective process where you adopt the results chain maybe in lieu of or together with a strategic action plan, and how you think that would happen, and also how quickly you think that might be implemented.
So maybe I'll ask Robert and Ryan to speak to it since they were in the trenches, and then I can overlay the reality from the grantor's perspective. So.
Yeah, I'll take the first shot at it. So you know, we've looked at various ways of integrating these concepts. So the Open Standards for Practice Conservation result change is one tool. It's sort of a bigger process for doing strategic planning for conservation. And so we've used various elements of that in different places and different circumstances. And we've also observed where, for example, that framework was sort of imposed on people that they needed to use it because it was sort of decided as being the best way to do that. And so across that, I think the conclusion for us is to be very, very careful about how much of this structure you impose on folks, but you look at what kinds of questions do you need to answer to lead to sort of building these results chains. I think that's where the power is when you're asking questions about you know, building a conceptual model on the front end. You're asking questions about what does our system look like? What are the things that we care about? What's impacting those things that we care about? What's contributing to those things, and where we might intervene? So you're asking those kinds of questions. So this is just a way to sort of show it visually. And I think one thing that we've attempted to do is show it in different ways. We show it through the narrative. We show it through the results chain, showing the relationships. We're showing it through the tables where some of the details are. And so we think, I guess I'm representing not we, but I think, you know, providing different ways of representing the elements that you would integrate into a strategic action plan like this would be the way to do it, because people look at these things in different ways and respond in different ways to the different ways, the different methods of sort of representing your thinking. So I don't know if I guess my caution is being really careful about imposing a structure on folks, but really introducing a process by which those questions are really answered clearly, and representing and providing some flexibility in terms of how they might represent that. I don't know if that made any sense.
I think it sounded great. Ryan Houston. I think because the strategic action planning process that the FIPs have all gone through fundamentally includes the same types of elements we're talking about here, I think it's a fairly smooth integration because we're not asking. If OWEB were to adopt something like this, OWEB would not be asking people to fundamentally change the way they're thinking about these things, which I think is great. And so if it were me and I were trying to integrate this in locally, I would basically ask myself, how do I start integrating this as a discussion tool in the next update of my strategic action plan? So bring in someone who's a good facilitator on these types of things and have my partners together and walk through this process as a way to visually articulate what we're doing and then use that to update the strategic action plan and then attach that thing to the back as an appendix. And then do the same thing on my monitoring plan that goes with it. And I think, again, since the strategic action planning and this process are very, very similar, it wouldn't be very painful. It would just be an addition of another way to look at it so that people can talk about it visually rather than just explore it narratively. And then over time, I think you could start weaving in other elements like, well, if we're having lots of disagreements about things, we could say, you know, maybe we're actually having a disagreement about that fundamental conceptual model about how we think the system works. Let's spend a little time doing that in a subcommittee or something. So I think it can be done, and I think it's, for people who really enjoy that kind of thinking, it's a great process. It's also really important to recognize not everyone enjoys that kind of thinking, and that's okay because those folks may have better skill sets and better uses of their time. So it's one of those things that probably works for part of the partnership, but not always for the whole thing.
Yeah, so Renee Davis for the record. I absolutely agree with Ryan on how we would use these with the current FIPS, because I do think that part of it is helping to not feel as though it's entirely new and incredibly overwhelming and different from what they already have established, but having the space for communicating how could you, fairly simply and when appropriate, blend it into existing strategic plan, existing monitoring, acknowledging that you're right, not all members of the partnership will want to geek out on this like you do, but also ensuring you have that communication mechanism within the existing FIP so that someone who's really in the thick of implementation doesn't feel as though, wait, where did this come from? I don't remember having addressed that as part of our initial planning. In terms of from here forward, I think one is we can very, very clearly start directly emphasizing use of some type of conceptual model, not prescribing it must be this results chain approach, but some type of conceptual model, logic model, and then a very direct connection within FIP applications between that conceptual model, whether it is a results chain, and what you're proposing by way of your monitoring framework. That was a miss. We did not have that luxury this last time. We were not prepared in that way. We do have a solicitation that is open currently, so I would say timing-wise, and Maida will throw something at me across the room if necessary, or maybe Eric Williams will kick me from behind. I do think it's probably realistic that for the next biennium solicitation, so we would be looking at 1921?
So
Yeah.
the current one doesn't open till January, and I think actually, Eric, you might speak to what you guys are asking in that, because I think you talk now about having them just describe their logic for how they got to where they got. So do you want to just speak to that really quickly? So we're starting down that path.
Hi, Eric Williams. We are still putting the finishing touches on the next solicitation, which we plan to release in January, as you've seen from our scheduling in the past. And the timing isn't quite right to fully incorporate all of this into that solicitation, but we do plan to introduce some form of a logic model concept to at least have that pathway of thinking outlined in the next applications that you'll see before you in the first 6 months of next year.
Will Newhouser, so I'm going to tie a couple of things together. I'm like Carl and Ryan, I guess, my brain works this way, so I like this sort of thing. I like it because it helps memorialize what is often in other people's heads, but not written down anywhere. And so typically it is one person out of the group. If you've got any, you've got one who's kind of the keeper of this stuff in my experience with interesting projects. And so if that person leaves the project, you kind of lose that connectivity tissue between all these pieces, and is the person who answers, hey, let's do this later. And you're like, well, you can't quite do that because it's tied to these other things. It makes a lot of sense for us to have worked on this in the FIPS because they're complicated systems, and so being able to get that recorded somehow can be really helpful. So the question, thinking back to our discussion about capacity grants earlier and so forth, is whether it would make sense to begin introducing this concept in simpler situations as a way to help start building that expertise. Not necessarily a requirement, that would be going a little far for the open solicitation grants and so forth. But these are also a little easier to do if it's a smaller contained project, fewer partners, all that sort of stuff. That might be a way to start building more of that expertise within the overall community, not just in the FIP implementer community, if you will, because that's a big step to go from never considered a logic model to building one of these elaborate kinds of things.
Yeah,
so just a thought to think about in the FIP capacity, as well as introducing a more streamlined version of this for more straightforward projects as a way to start building that community sense of this stuff.
Yeah, absolutely. For the record, Renee Davis, I absolutely agree with you, Will. I think there's some staging here, starting to blend it into the next implementation, solicitation. We could do the same as we are offering funding for strategic plans through the capacity building FIPS, knowing though that this is a very complicated process. So I think what you said about a simplified version is key to just start though the wheels turning intellectually on that type of reframing. And then also with the funding that's going to BEF for the FIP gathering, beginning to build that community of practice around how you do this, and having folks who've been through it and have a lot of expertise and passion around it, having other folks who are just coming to understand what it might mean, but starting to grow that capacity there too, to continue to expand that universe of folks who have the ability and interest in this.
So this is Maida. I might just mention one thing that Sean Morford raised in passing yesterday. So one of the webinar sessions that she held was specifically on results change and not for FIPS or FIP capacity building or anything, and had 54 folks attending. So I think, Will, what you're saying is actually coming to fruition kind of alongside of all of this work, that there's a pretty strong interest. And I think in that FIP gathering in February, we have not just the existing ones, but the new ones who were funded this time. So I think there is a chance to really start incorporating these conversations as we go. And I think we have some great partners who are doing that on our behalf already.
Well, yeah, thanks. I'd forgotten that you had mentioned that. Other questions, comments for our distinguished panel? Laura?
Laura Masterson. I think also think it's cool, and I like it, and I wonder how you do the cost-benefit analysis for the analysis. Because there's always like, I want more information, but how is that information, like, is that really going to inform or change the decision? And so I just, how do you do that?
Yeah, and that, as I hear the discussion, this is Robert Warren. As I hear these discussions, I have a lot of anxiety because I've seen this go off the rails, and I've seen, I think we mentioned in our first presentation where there's the law of diminishing returns really applies here. The more boxes and arrows don't always equal a better product, and there are a lot of people that really love, and I have seen results change that would, that would induce nausea. I mean, they can become really, really complicated because people really get into it. And so having the discipline to know when to stop and to say, this is what, this is enough for us to make decisions, and then moving forward with those decisions. So the idea of, starting simple, but sort of keeping it simple is really important. I don't know how you do that cost-benefit analysis, but I think it's, I've seen planning processes that were supposed to go months go on for 4 years because people kept wanting to make more conceptual models and more results change. So that's where the caution comes from and sort of the anxiety for, but I think it's possible to do. I mean, we're presenting this idea because we have seen it work. We have seen it force people to think differently or help people think differently and more strategically about their work. But the process needs to serve the people. The people don't need to serve the process, and that's...
So Laura, Renee Davis, for the record, one thing I would say is that it's important how we message this too, because if we provide the perception that a very, very detailed results chain is what we're looking for, then that one is not going to be cost effective, and it's frankly going to be incredibly off-putting. So I think some of this, in terms of how do we have some of those more simplified, tempered, staged approaches, and ask for really authentic feedback about how is this working for you, what part isn't, and not just asking for, hey, tell us that it was a grand approach to use, but really being open to that kind of authentic feedback to hopefully find that sweet spot around cost-benefit analysis rather than a process that sinks beneath its own weight.
Dan?
Yeah, Dan Thornick. I have the answer. You just impose a minimum font size for an 8-minute left.
There you go.
And if you can't read it, you can't really use it anyway.
Those are supposed to be 11 by 17.
Okay, 11 by 17.
Can I add one piece of that?
Yeah. Maida?
So Laura, this is Maida for the record. I think from my perspective, what I get excited about for this for all of our grantees is honestly not the logic model. It really is the thought process. And I think one of the challenges that we've had in particular as it relates to monitoring. So we can say we need cooler water temperatures, and so we're going to plant more trees. But then what are the things that you can look at before it's 15 years out and the trees are big enough to see that we're headed in the right direction? And what I like about this process is when they showed this to me the first time, it really pops the things that you can monitor in the short term that help you course correct in the long term. And that is one of the things I get really excited about, because it helps move us from, okay, I can count how many trees I planted, to I can't talk about anything until 20 years down the road. What can I look at in the interim? And I think this thought process really helps that. So my hope from our perspective goes back a little bit to what Will said, and that is, how do we help people incorporate this into the way of their thinking, whether it's a project or a FIP or a 50-year plan, that it's just it becomes part of the way people think about this stuff and how they evaluate.
Laura Masterson, so what were the things?
Do you want to talk a little bit, Ryan, about the things I'm going to call specifically out the Deschutes, some of the things that you look at so that you can know on the interim that you were headed the right direction on white.
Because I think these are the kinds of discussions that are helpful for me, rather than theoretically sort of things were learned, like what things.
Yeah, I'm trying to figure out how to frame this up. So
it's your little.
Thanks, Maida. Yeah.
The little one pager that I always present when I talk about white shoes that has the bugs.
Exactly.
And that one.
Yeah, and so let's see, what's the best way to frame this up? We were basically looking at in one of our creeks, White Shoes Creek. We were looking at what are all the different indicators, miniature metrics that show us whether we're moving toward or away from the thing we care about. And the toward or away concept came from our local NRCS partners who used that phrasing that really crystallized for us. And we asked ourselves, even though we can't get to the shade measurement yet that Maida was referring to, or we can't get to the returning adults for the anatomous fish measurement yet because they're not back yet, what are the individual things we can look at that tell us we're slowly sort of building that system? And so for us, it became a series of smaller metrics, and I think what you're referring to made probably some macroinvertebrate metrics, some specific drivers of temperature metrics, and this is a little bit related to what Randy was asking about earlier, is, what are the drivers of the thing you are concerned about, and how do you actually get really specific about defining them? And so to emphasize what Maida said, the benefit for us going through this process years ago was the discussion, not the product. And it's almost one of those things where you spend a day working with people. You walk out and you go, wow, that was really inspiring, that was really exciting, that was really interesting. Then you see the product and you go, is that all? Because it was actually a really cool discussion, but it's that discussion that sticks with you more than the product. And so I don't know if that's addressing what you were referring to, Maida, but that's my best shot here on the fly.
They looked at bugs.
You could have said that.
Which, so you have a 50-year metric, but the bug metric.
Yeah, they're a one-year turnaround, yeah.
It has a lot quicker turnaround, and I don't think without this discussion that might have been the thing you monitored.
Yep. You could have said that 5 minutes ago, and I would have had a more concise answer.
No, it was a good answer.
Anything else from folks? All right, thank you guys very much.
Thank you.
Do you have any administrivia?
The only administrivia is the lunches will be available. You can take them as box lunches, and then we'll have just, for those of you who are participating in the tour, we'll have a little bit of time for you to grab lunch, change into your boots and things like that, and then we'll head out. Eric, are we meeting out in front of here?
Right out front here. Yeah.
Okay, so right out in front of here for those of you who are going. From a less administrative perspective, from the staff end, I just again want to give a huge thank you to Dan and John and Carl at your last meeting here. So thanks for sticking through it till the end, actually making motions and things like that.
This is Will. I was going to say the same thing. I wasn't going to say goodbye. I was going to say thank you. Really appreciate it.
They're actually working on